Revolutionary. Immortality. Mao Tse, and the Chinese Cultural Revolution. By Robert J. Lifton. Preface. Books are responses to events. The unusual events in China from mid-1966 and through early on 96 Baba led me to attempt a rather unusual kind of book. It is about Mao Tse and the Cultural Revolution, but its larger concern is with men's efforts to render their works, and especially their revolutionary works, eternal. It is therefore a study of the vicissitudes of human continuity. The book evolves from a long-standing general interest in the contemporary interplay of psychology and history, as well as a specific interest in Communist China's unique efforts at remaking men and women according to her ideological vision. My earlier study, Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism, explored these efforts as they extended into the late 1950s, including the Hundra and Flowers episode of 1956-1957 and its aftermath. During the early 1960s my research interests turned to Japan, but I continued to follow events on the mainland as closely as I could. Once one has immersed oneself in matters Chinese, one never quite extricates oneself from them, nor does one wish to. Until about the beginning of 1966, although much of great interest continued to take place in China, I had the pre-factual impression that events were generally consistent with the patterns of reform or rectification, followed by relative liberalization, that I had previously observed. During the late spring and early summer of 1966, however, this suddenly ceased to be true. Reports were confused, but they left no doubt that a movement of a very different order was developing. I found myself, like many others, puzzled and fascinated as I followed the Cultural Revolution from New Haven, New York, Cape Cod, and then London. My earlier work had provided many possible leads, but these seemed if anything to deepen the mystery. At that time a new English edition of my book on thought reform was being scheduled, and the publisher's suggestion that I add a brief section on the Cultural Revolution seemed to me both sensible and problematic. Fortunately I was soon to be on my way to the Far East for a half-year of follow-up interviews with young Japanese, and in February 1967 one was able to arrange a brief stay in Hong Kong for the purpose of gaining a closer glimpse of mainland events. The Hong Kong re-exposure was invaluable. There I could gather a great variety of extremely useful materials, and at the same time exchange impressions with a large number of China watchers who were thinking, talking about, and imbibing nothing but the Cultural Revolution. I could also converse at length with a few Westerners and Chinese who had recently come from the mainland, including one young man who had been actively involved in the Red Guard movement. I was thus able to obtain a feel of the Cultural Revolution, a sense of the extra preface 13 denarii environment that had been created in China and of the forces contributing to that environment. I became increasingly aware that the general psychological principles governing the thought reform process could not adequately illuminate the Cultural Revolution. Its agitated extremities of destruction and attempted revitalization demanded a larger perspective, one that could deal with man's struggles for various forms of renewal and transcendence. I had been thinking about such a perspective for some time in relationship to other work. Partly from research in Hiroshima, but also from a continuing effort to formulate the nature of the individual experience in historical change, I had evolved a series of concepts around what I call modes of symbolic immortality. These deal with both death symbolism and human continuity, and in a work in progress I had begun to apply them to different epochs and to a general view of the historical process. The approach is consistent with Otto Rank's emphasis upon man's continuing need for an assurance of eternal survival for his self. But while Rank saw this need as part of man's irrational nature, it seemed to me best understood as an aspect of his symbolic life, which in itself is neither rational nor irrational but comprehensible within a formal and scientific framework. The sense of immortality, then, is the individual's connection with man's general past and future. I found the concept of symbolic immortality to be highly relevant to the issues of personal and historical continuity, and to related matters of ideological purity, dominating the Cultural Revolution. What seemed indicated was a 14, preface careful exploration, in the light of this concept, of forces at play in that movement. But this kind of exploration had to take on its own autonomy, had to become at the very least a slim volume. In Tokyo during the spring of 1967 one worked with some excitement on the first draft of the manuscript. It was a good place to do so, for Japanese reporters and travelers were moving more freely among the participants in the Cultural Revolution than were their Western counterparts. They were also better able to read the wall posters, and in their reports as well as in our conversations they conveyed perhaps better than any other group a vivid sense of the movement's evangelical enthusiasm and zealotry. Once I was back in the United States I had opportunities to present the general argument of the book, first to a summer work group devoted to psycho-historical problems, and then to a Yale audience of faculty and students in Chinese studies. The responses evoked strengthened my belief that this unconventional approach could have significance for a variety of people coming to the subject from very different vantage points. What has emerged is an interpretive essay whose central theme, that of revolutionary immortality, serves to organize a large number of divergent events and attitudes. I want to stress that this is by no means the only theme one could have chosen for such a purpose. One could have instead emphasized the economic strains of a developing country, China's confrontation with America, the Sino-Soviet dispute, or the inevitable conflicts arising in the preface 15 history of any revolution. Large historical events cannot be attributed to a single cause, nor grasped by a single explanation. Neither is mine the only possible psychological approach. One could have stressed, for instance, Mao's individual psychological development in more usual psychoanalytic terms, with emphasis upon the monumental conflict with his father which all accounts suggest. Indeed, a full-scale psychobiography of Mao will surely be undertaken sometime in the future, but that is not my intention here. Rather, I focus upon certain features of Mao's psychological and revolutionary style as these come to bear upon a series of personal and historical exigencies of his and China's situation. Such a focus is part of a continuing effort to find new conceptual connections between individual and collective patterns, especially under extreme historical conditions. What I would claim for the use of the theme of symbolic immortality is a particular pertinence to this kind of extreme episode, and a general inclusiveness permitting the alternative themes mentioned earlier to be taken into account. It enables me, for instance, to explore, in what I believe to be a new way, an excruciatingly complex encounter between man and technology. While rejecting the simple polarity of rational versus irrational behavior, I have found it necessary here to make certain psychological judgments concerning attitudes and behavior as they relate to the potentialities of the environment. One example is the concept of psychism, the exaggerated reliance upon will and psychic power to achieve technological goals. But I apply 16. Preface the concept only where there have been strong indications of this tendency, as confirmed by peculiarly self-defeating results. The evidence I cite does not derive from the kind of systematic series of interviews I have done in connection with previous work. I did conduct a number of interviews and found them extremely informative. But I also depend upon observations at a distance upon writings and reported actions of Mao and others, and I do not hesitate to speculate about the relationship of these to the general themes I develop. I do, however, attempt to discipline this speculation both by seeking converging evidence from several directions and by making explicit the steps of my psychological argument. Above all, I stress shared experience and avoid resorting to what I regard as a solipsistic tendency all too common in my own profession, that of viewing large historical events as nothing but manifestations of someone's individual psychopathology. I have in fact become newly impressed by the potential usefulness of a category of data falling somewhere between group ideology and individual psychological style, a level of experience that has been largely ignored but which, I believe, will take on considerable future importance for both psychologists and historians. I confine myself to the Chinese Cultural Revolution, preferring to leave farther-ranging theoretical explorations for another study. But as my title implies, I see the Chinese situation as a paradigm for revolutions in general. Hence, I believe that the experience of the Soviet Union could be profitably re-examined in relationship to the theme of revolutionary immortality, focusing upon the early ex-preface 17 Zion of the Marxist-Leninist vision, and viewing subsequent developments under Stalin, Khrushchev, and the present regime as embodying simultaneous attempts to eternalize and alter that vision. One could bring a similar approach to the French Revolution, and to a number of other partial or even failed revolutions. Not that these events are all the same, indeed, the framework I suggest might shed some light on why one revolution aborts at its inception, another changes the world, and a third succeeds and then consumes itself. To generalize in this way does not preclude, and in fact requires, a stress upon what is peculiarly Chinese. Only from an emphasis upon cultural roots and historical context can one derive the stuff of generalization. An upheaval like the Cultural Revolution demonstrates all too forcibly the need to view Chinese behavior neither as identical in motivation and nuance with Western behavior, nor as a self-enclosed form of Oriental exoticism. To see Chinese experience as both distinctive and part of the general flow of human events would seem a simple enough principle, but it has been long in coming into practice. China differentiates herself from the West by means of her specific combination of cultural symbols evolved over the course of her history. But these symbols depend upon psychobiological potential available to all men in all epochs. They are, moreover, subject to the increasingly shared currents of world history. Finally, I hope that this essay speaks to certain contemporary issues quite beyond China's struggles or even general questions of revolution. I refer to dilemmas of historical discontinuity, to the broken connection or I-18, preface-paired sense of immortality that now affect people in every society. By gaining some understanding of China's resulting combination of desperation and excess, we may better learn to live not only with her but with ourselves as well. My hope in fact is that the study of a closed and totalistic revolutionary vision will serve to strengthen the more humane and searching forms of radical thought now struggling to take shape throughout the world, especially among the young. My debts in this work are many, but I will mention only a few of them: enlarging dialogues over the years with Eric H. Erickson, David Reisman, and Kenneth Keniston, continuing mentorship on matters Chinese from Benjamin I. Schwartz, John K. Fairbank, Mary C. N. Wright, and Arthur F. Wright, thoughtful responses to the manuscript from all of the above, as well as from Jonathan D. Spence, Lawrence W. Chisholm, and Frederick C. Redlick, valuable suggestions from members of the group for the study of psychohistorical process, generous help with references and Chinese terminology from Wei-Ying Wan, careful preparation of the manuscript by Lily B. Finn, and much of everything from my wife, Betty Jean Lifton. New Haven, Connecticut. March, 1968. I. 2. 111. V. 6. 7. 8. Lux. Contents: the power struggle, an approach; the death of the leader, the death of the revolution, the quest for rebirth, purity and power, the immortalization of words, technology and psychism, time and totalism, psychological limitations beyond the last stand. Source notes index 1. 9. 17. 29. 43. 61. 99. 127. 149. 163. 171. The struggle. An approach. We do well to recognize our ignorance of China. That ignorance has been perpetuated by 2 decades of virtual absence of either diplomatic or journalistic contact between the United States and China, a situation which, in the not-too-distant future, will surely be regarded as a historical oddity of the mid-20th century. Moreover, even those Westerners and other non-Chinese who have been permitted extensive residence on the mainland have rarely had an opportunity to observe closely the actual states of mind of individual Chinese. Nor has the regime been interested in revealing much more than its own ideal image of what that state of mind should be. It is nonetheless possible that we have become too accustomed to a stance of ignorance. For a good deal of significant information has been reaching us from people coming out of China, from the official press and radio, and from a great variety of semi-official and unofficial writings and speeches seemed to be expecting or at least hoping for that specific news item that would, once and for all, supply the missing piece to the puzzle and lay bare the power struggle or establish the diagnosis. The American stress upon mechanism and the Chinese emphasis upon human relationships are themselves ideological, both can be thought of as anti-ideological ideologies. But there have also been, in Hong Kong and elsewhere throughout the world, much more thoughtful approaches to an understanding of the Cultural Revolution. These have stressed such factors as China's complex, the nostalgia for the heroic revolutionary methods and achievements of days gone by, China's abrupt loss of a comfortable relationship to her own cultural past, her sense of mounting threat from the outside, especially from America's intervention in Vietnam, and her undergoing a kind of Protestant-Catholic dispute between evangelical reawakening and established bureaucratic compromise. All of these interpretations contain considerable truth, and the first in particular illuminates much of what has been occurring. But we have lacked a general perspective within which to comprehend both psychological motives and historical context, that is, a psycho-historical framework. I propose such a framework, however tentative and precarious, because I believe it can reveal much about motivations behind and relationships between seemingly unfathomable and disjointed events, and at the same time possibly contribute to the general understanding of such upheavals, wherever they may occur. My goal is not to reduce the vast canvas of the Cultural Revolution to a set of individual psychological observations. Rather, I wish to suggest a theoretical perspective which, while unitary, is also open and broadly inclusive, and which stresses shifting symbols and forms in the interplay of the individual with the collective. The approach, then, as I have elsewhere indicated, is most accurately termed that of psychoformation. The power struggle, and approach 7. I should like to suggest of what has been taking place in China actually Cambuntprastukle a quest for revolutionary immortality. By revolutionary immortality, I mean a shared sense of participating in permanent revolutionary fermentation, and of transcending individual death by living on indefinitely within this continuing revolution. Some such vision has been present in all revolutions and was directly expressed in Trotsky's ideological principle of permanent revolution, but it has taken on unprecedented intensity in present-day Chinese communist experience. Central to this point of view is the concept of symbolic immortality I have described in earlier work, of man's need, in the face of inevitable biological death, to maintain an inner sense of continuity with what has gone on before and what will go on after his own individual existence. From this point of view, the sense of immortality is much more than a mere denial of death. It is part of compelling, life-enhancing imagery binding each individual person to significant groups and events removed from him in place and time. It is the individual's inner perception of his involvement in what we call the historical process. The sense of immortality may be expressed biologically, by living on through one's sons and daughters and their sons and daughters, theologically, in the idea of a life after death or of other forms of spiritual conquest of death, creatively, or through works and influences persisting beyond biological death, through identification with nature, and with its infinite extension into time and space, or experientially, through a feeling state that of experience. 8. Tile transcendence so intense that, at least temporarily, it eliminates time and death. While this may at first seem a rather abstract approach to the passions and actions of old revolutionaries and young followers, I believe that only by recognizing such life and death components of the revolutionary psyche can we begin to comprehend precisely these passions and actions. Point 2. Applying these modes of symbolic immortality to the revolutionary, we may say that he becomes part of a vast family reaching back to what he perceives to be the historical beginnings of his revolution and extending infinitely into the future. This socially created family tends to replace the biological one as a mode of immortality. Moreover, it can itself take on an increasingly biological quality, as, over the generations, revolutionary identifications become blended with national, cultural, and racial ones. The revolutionary denies theology as such, but embraces a secular utopia through images closely related to the spiritual conquest of death and even to an afterlife. His revolutionary works are all important, and only to the extent that he can perceive them as enduring can he achieve a measure of acceptance of his own eventual death. The natural world to which he allies himself is one that must be transformed by revolution while continuing to contain all that revolution creates. And his experiential transcendence can approach that of religious mystics, as a glance at some of the younger participants in China's Cultural Revolution confirms. What all this suggests, then, is that the essence of the power struggle taking place in China, as of all such power struggles, is power over death. The death of the leader. Central to China's recent crisis, I believe, is a form of anxiety related to both the anticipated death of a great leader and the death of the revolution he has so long dominated. This death anxiety is shared by leader and followers alike, but we do best to focus for a time upon the former. It is impossible to know Mao's exact physical or mental state. But let us assume, on the basis of evidence we have, that the 74-year-old man has generally been vigorous, that he has experienced rather severe illness in recent years, and that he has always been a man of strong revolutionary passions. We can go a bit further, however, especially on the basis of a valuable interview with him conducted by Edgar Snow, perhaps the American who over the years has been closest to Mao. In January 1965. Snow found Mao alert, wholly relaxed, and impressive in his stamina during their 4-hour meeting. Snow also states that one of the chairman's doctors informed me that Mao has no organic troubles and suffers from nothing beyond the normal fatigue of his age, and points out that an interview of that kind, coming as it did at the end of strenuous weeks devoted to the National People's Congress, might have been more speedily. 12. Found him reflecting on man's rendezvous with death and ready to leave the assessment of his political legacy to future generations. Indeed, Snow's general description of the interview suggests a man anticipating, if not preoccupied with, death. Snow reports Mao to have said that he was going to see God. And when Snow responded by reassuring Mao that he seemed to be in good condition that evening, Mao Tse-tung smiled wryly and expressed some doubt, again saying that he was getting ready to see God very soon. We need not dwell on Mao's rather striking use of the theological idiom, other than attributing it to a combination terminated by a sick man. But he describes watching Mao, after seeing Snow to his car, brace his shoulders and slowly retrace his steps, leaning heavily on the arm of an aide. Subsequent observations on his health differ, but they suggest that from 1965 through 1967 he was neither completely well nor totally incapacitated. The infrequency of his public appearances and his even rarer public speeches, together with a certain amount of observed bodily rigidity, have led to speculation that he might be suffering from some kind of arteriosclerotic condition, or possibly a form of paralysis agitans. Such conditions could affect the mental state, both through organic damage and compensatory efforts to deny incapacity, with related changes in symbolic organization of thought. But if dysfunction were present, it would probably take the form of exaggeration or even caricature of prior psychological tendencies rather than the sudden appearance of totally new ones. Snow presents Mao's statements in close third-person paraphrase, rather than direct quotation, in accordance with an agreement he made with Mao's aides. He was able to check his own recollections with a written record kept by one of the Chinese who had been present. The death of the leader. 13. Shin of playfulness and perhaps an unconscious inclination on the part of a Inan who early in his life had renounced rural supernatural beliefs in favor of Marxist scientific ones to hedge his bets a little. When Snow questioned him on the Inatter, he denied any belief in a deity but observed rather whimsically that some people who claimed to be well informed said there was a God. There seemed to be many gods and sometimes the same God could take all sides. More important from our standpoint are the reminiscences that immediately follow about family members who had died, about his career as a revolutionary, and about the chance combination of reasons that had caused him to become interested in the founding of the Chinese Communist Party. Involved here is an old man's nostalgic need to review his past life in relationship to his forthcoming death. That is, death is seen as a test of the quality of one's overall existence. And in the face of a threat of total extinction, one feels the need to give form to that existence, to formulate its basic connectedness, its movement or development, and above all its symbolic integrity or cohesion and significance. Prominent among these reminiscences is Mao's sense of being an eternal survivor, his recollections of both his brothers having been killed, of the execution of X's first wife during the revolution, and the death of their son during the Korean War. Mao commented that it was odd that he had escaped death, that although he was often prepared for it, death just did not seem to want him. He described several narrow escapes from which he emerged. 14. Revolutionary immortality unscathed, including one in which he was splashed all over with the blood of another soldier. Mao seems to be telling us that his death is both imminent and long overdue. What he considers remarkable is not that so many family members and revolutionary comrades have died around him, but that he has in each case been spared. He recognized the survivor's characteristically guilt-laden need to contrast his own continuing life with others' deaths. #For Mao is surely the survivor par excellence, the hero of a truly epic story of revolutionary survival, that of the Long March of 1934-1935, in which it is believed that more than 8% of the original group perished along a 6,000-mile plus or minus wreck in order that the remainder and the revolution itself might stay alive. To transcend his guilt, the survivor must be able to render significant the death immersions he has experienced and, in Mao's case, done much to bring about. This kind of survivor formulation faces both ways: justification of the past and contribution to the future. Thus, for a man in Mao's position of his age and spiritual commitments, the affirmation of a sense of immortality becomes crucial. The overwhelming threat is not so zero. There is a suggestion here also of the survivor's sense of reinforced invulnerability, of having met death and, by means of a special destiny, conquered it. It is this sense that permits the survivor to enter into the myth of the hero, as we shall see to be the case with Mao. But I have found that such feelings can be fragile, and can readily reverse themselves to expose a heightened sense of vulnerability concealed beneath. Point 2. The death of the leader. 15. Death itself as the suggestion that his revolutionary works will not endure. We sense the passion behind his apparent calm as he goes on, during the same interview, to describe the two possibilities for the future: the first, the continued development of the revolution toward communism, and the second, that youth could negate the revolution and give a poor performance, make peace with imperialism, bring the remnants of the Chiang Kai-shek clique back to the mainland and take a stand beside the small percentage of counter-revolutionaries still in the country. The first is an image of continuous life, the second of death and extinction, of impaired immortality. What he said next, of course he did not hope for counter-revolution. But future events would be decided by future generations. Is unexpectedly stark in its suggestion of negative possibility. He is, in other words, far from certain about the fate of his revolutionary works, about the vindication of his own life. The death of the revolution. Mao's ultimate dread, the image of extinction that stalks him, is the death of the revolution. When he speaks of the possible poor performance of the young, his overriding concern is that the immortal revolutionary legacy will be squandered. As he pointed out to Snow in that same interview, those in China now under the age of 20 have never fought a war and never seen an imperialist or known capitalism in power. His fear is not simply that the young are too soft, but that they may be incapable of sharing and perpetuating the worldview that created the revolution. For that worldview was based upon his and his generation's specific experience, and as he goes on to say about the young, they knew nothing about the old society at first hand. Parents could tell them, but to hear about history and to read books was not the same thing as living it. That is, in such unknowing hands the sacred thing itself, the revolution, could be abused, neglected, permitted to die. Such historical death can, for the revolutionary, represent an end of the world, an ultimate deformation. 20. It may cause anxiety similar to or and de-symbolization. 0 even greater than that associated with the idea of individual death. Actually, the two forms of death anxiety become inseparable. If the revolution is to be extinguished, the dying revolutionary can envision nothing but the total extinction of his own self. Maoists repeatedly call forth certain specific images to suggest the danger of the death of the revolution. These include American imperialism, feudalism, the capitalist road, bourgeois remnants, and modern revisionism. American imperialism is the ultimate enemy to which one must be alert, lest it destroy the revolution through power or guile. But the threat it poses is external and therefore largely visible. Feudal or capitalist and bourgeois remnants, on the other hand, are doubly dangerous because, as retained internal poisons whose effects are mainly upon the mind, they tend to be invisible. They thus require constant psychic purging, as provided by the extensive programs of thought reform so long prominent in Chinese communist practice. But what has recently emerged as the greatest threat of all is modern revisionism. For it is both an external danger, as embodied by a visible friend-turned-enemy, the Soviet Union, and an internal one of an insidious personal nature. It is a form of degeneracy or inner death experienced by those who once knew the true path to revolutionary immortality but, through a combination of moral weakness and shadowy conspiracy, strayed from it. Much more than the other zero, all of these terms refer to symbolic death, through loss of viable relationship to the forms and symbols which sustain psychic life. The death of the revolution. 21. Negatus irniges, modern revisionism looms as almost an immediate possibility. But why NMV? Why the current crisis in revolutionary immortality? There is much evidence that the Cultural Revolution represents the culmination of a series of conflicts surrounding totalistic visions and national campaigns, of an increasing inability to fulfill the visions or achieve the transformations of the physical and spiritual environment claimed by the campaigns. The conflicts took on great intensity over the decade including the late 1950s and early 1960s, and found their quintessential expression in what was surely the most remarkable campaign of all prior to the Cultural Revolution, the Great Leap Forward of 1958. I shall later examine more closely the cast of mind associated with the Great Leap, and the technological and psychological impediments involved. It was a heroic attempt to achieve rapid industrialization and collectivization by making extensive use of the bare hands and pure minds of the Chinese people. Its massive failures resulted in overwhelming death imagery in several ways. It produced widespread confusion and suffering even as the regime was announcing its brilliant achievements. And its extensive falsification of statistics reached down, it was later learned, to virtually every level of party cadre. This the kind of energy the Chinese communists have long mobilized against feudal remnants influences from the old society believed to threaten China's future now seem to be directed against modern revisionism. The shift in emphasis has great historical significance, but the quality of urgency and danger is psychologically consistent in the two cases. 22 Revolutionary immortality falsification represented something more than merely a conscious attempt on the part of the regime to deceive the outside world. It was an expression of a powerful need to maintain a collective image of revolutionary vitality that became, so to speak, more real than reality itself. Such visions of transformation had become so basic to Chinese communist practice and in many cases had been so brilliantly realized that they could not be abandoned without a sense that the fundamental momentum of the revolution, its life force, was ebbing. And the disparity between vision and experience became manifest. We suspect earlier confidence in China's revolutionary immortality must have been severely undermined even among those closest to Mao who had in the past shared most enthusiastically in his vision. Whether one attributed the Great Leap's failure to insufficient revolutionary zeal or to an excess of the same, all came to feel anxious about the life of the revolution. The regime's subsequent economic backtracking and cultural liberalization, upguidedly implemented by the pragmatists despite Maoist resistance, also contributed to these conflicts. Measures deemed necessary for national recovery encouraged precisely the kinds of personal freedom and self-interest readily viewed within Chinese communist ideology as decadent individualism and economism. That is, Liberalization posed a severe threat to the totalistic vision of absolute subjugation of self to regime upon which the overall claim to revolutionary the death of the revolution. 23. Immortality had been built. The same pattern had occurred before, following the 100 Flowers episode of 1956-1957, an even more celebrated program of relaxation strongly influenced by Khrushchev's revelations about Stalin, by the Hungarian uprising, and by economic difficulties in China itself. At that time the Chinese shared in the general shattering of the image of infallibility surrounding the Soviet Union as the center of world communism, and this must also have raised questions about their own mode of revolutionary immortality. The liberalization of 1961-1962, following several years of economic strain and general unrest caused by the failure of the Great Leap, did not produce quite the luxuriant across-the-board condemnation of the regime that took place at the time of the 100 Flowers. But there was nevertheless a muted historical repetition. More important, precisely the things said by many intellectuals during the demand for the emphasis of politics and for stress upon learning for its own sake, and especially the mockery of the regime's claim to infallibility came to be denounced later as signs of degeneracy and decay. The very fruits of liberalization became, for Mao and certain other Chinese leaders, death-tainted threats to the immortal revolutionary vision. From 1962 onward, and especially since 1965, the regime has been struggling to reassert the confident relationship to history it had possessed in earlier days. The split among party leaders has had much to do with the image held of just how one should go about doing this. Revolu**Visionary 1 Immortality. 24. During the pre-cultural revolution decade Mao encountered increasing opposition because of his long commitment to the kind of heroic but unrealizable vision that reached its zenith in the Great Leap Forward. From within the party have sought to moderate this vision and to pursue programs resembling the less militant Soviet example. They apparently succeeded in curbing Mao's influence, at least temporarily, during the late 1950s and early 1960s. This resistance to Mao, leading to his resignation under pressure from the state chairmanship in December 1958, could take shape only because of the growing conviction that alternatives to policies were absolutely necessary for economic and social stability. But Mao was later to refer scornfully to such pragmatists as women with bound feet and to associate their caution with remnants of the dying old regime. To Mao and his supporters both his partial ouster and the programmatic alternatives of his opponents were expressions of betrayal of the revolutionary vision, evidences of death and deterioration. 4. Peking wall posters reported Mao to have said, in October 1966. "I was extremely discontented with that decision, but I could do nothing about it." And Xiao, without relying on the accuracy of the wall posters, concludes that the existing evidence suggests that Mao gave up his state chairmanship not entirely by his own choice. But there are some observers who, stressing the importance of doctrine for the Chinese Communists, accept the official version given out at the time of the decision, namely, that Mao was being relieved of his duties as state chairman in order to make it possible for him to spare more of his time to do the theoretical work of Marxism-Leninism. The death of the revolution. 25. Maoists later called forth the picturesque idiom of Chinese folklore to place these critics in the center of a demonology referring to them as demons, devils, monsters, ogres, ghosts, and freaks. But demonology always addresses itself to the management of life and death, and includes an implicit theory of what might be called negative immortality, incarnations of evil which never die out, whatever one does to counter their nefarious influences. Groups like the Maoists who so boldly defy human limitation are inevitably plagued in turn by images of supernatural enemies. For demonology also reflects unacceptable subterranean conflicts. The devils and monsters under attack are largely inner doubts of Maoist causes concerning their own omnipotence, they are in effect anti-immortals. What are some of these deadly influences? Much of the rhetoric during the Cultural Revolution and the socialist education movement preceding it has been a reaction and an answer to ideas expressed during the preceding year, of liberalization. Under attack at the philosophical level have been theories of human nature along with expressions of humanism making their way to China from Russian and Eastern European intellectual circles. For such concepts deny that class origin is the ultimate moral and psychological determinant of behavior, the first by insisting that certain characteristics are shared by all of mankind, and the second through a principle the Chinese contemptuously term love for all people, under which even capitalists and landlords become worthy of sympathy. Ideas like these are dangerous because they could 26 revolutionary immortality mean the Maoist vision of revolutionary immortality by encouraging people to revert to alternative intellectual traditions which extol quests for truth and self-realization. Or in the somewhat more pejorative language of the Cultural Revolution, they lead to desires to get on by politics, be really good at your specialty, and have a good life. These ideas emerge from post-Stalinist thought, from modern revisionism, and express a rediscovery of the individual. But in Chinese media they are dismissed as a philosophy of survival. Paradoxically, a humanist principle of love for all people becomes associated with degeneration into a putrefying bourgeoisie, with traits that deserve to be relegated to the morgue. Humanist principles extolling man's life are now seen as agents of death, as demons that must be exorcised lest their deadly emanations destroy all. The Chinese have also had to cope with a more concrete form of death anxiety, as stimulated by the war in Vietnam and the fear of war with America. There is good evidence that the repeated characterization of America as a paper tiger by no means eliminates in Chinese minds images of annihilation associated with her destructive power. And Mao has in the past regularly instituted large-scale programs of reform and rectification when preparing for actual military combat. But I believe that the fear of war with America is in itself less of a fundamental source of the Cultural Revolution than an aggravating factor in the overall death anxiety surrounding it. And the Cultural Revolution itself appears to be more a quest for a collective sense of revolutionary power than an actual mobilization of military power to combat an outside enemy. The death of the revolution. 27. China's crisis, then, involves a profound general threat to revolutionary immortality intertwined with the anxious concern of an aging, partly infirm leader hero about his capacity, through his revolutionary contributions, to outlive himself. The explosive disruption of a unified revolutionary vision has enormous significance as both cause and effect. For in the absence of such a vision, each individual self becomes vulnerable to the anxiety of extinction associated both with biological death and with collective forms of de-symbolization. No wonder that elements of the historical past of both Chinese tradition and the modern encounter with the West take on newly ominous qualities. Ghosts and demons must be slain again and again as fear for the life of the revolution becomes associated with fear of the dead. To remain calm, to act with measure in the face of such a threat, can be perceived as an intolerable form of inactivation and stasis. The psychological stage is reached in which one cannot dispense with one's hatred. One cannot give up one's enemies. The quest for rebirth. The activist response to symbolic death or to what might be called unmastered death anxiety is a quest for rebirth. One could in fact view the entire Cultural Revolution as a demand for renewal of communist life. It is, in other words, a call for reassertion of revolutionary immortality. Plus or minus losing sight of antagonisms among individual without leaders wedo well to consider the significance of the cultural in this unique revolution. We may speak of culture, in its broadest anthropological sense, as an accumulation of significant symbols, or, as Clifford Geertz has recently written, of symbolic sources of illumination which each man requires to put a construction upon events, to orient himself to the ongoing course of experienced things. Mao seems to have a similarly inclusive view of human culture, but unlike Western anthropologists he feels compelled to regulate its tone and content, at least within J1's nation, and to take steps to alter it radically when it seems to be moving in undesirable directions. 0 A cultural revolution anywhere involves a collect 0 The idea that the state and its officials should manage the cultural tone of society, should supervise the songs people sing, the rituals they follow, the principles by which they live goes far back in tip shift in the psychic knowledge around which life is organized. In Maoist China, however, it has meant nothing less than an all-consuming death and rebirth experience, an induced catastrophe together with a prescription for reconstituting the world being destroyed. The total mobilization of faith involved in this prescription for rebirth has been peculiarly autistic. For more than a year the Chinese turned in upon themselves, performing actions required by their inner states or those of their leaders, however inappropriate or repugnant these actions may have seemed to a perplexed and fascinated outside world. In this sense the Cultural Revolution moves in the direction of what I propose to call psychism, the attempt to achieve control over one's external environment through internal or psychological manipulations, through behavior determined by intrapsychic needs no longer in touch with the actual ties of the world one seeks to influence. I shall have much to say about such psychism as a predominant element in the Cultural Revolution's Maoist call to life. The agents of this attempted rebirth, the Red Guards, reveal much about its nature. The tenderness of their Chinese tradition. It is an aspect of the holistic view of man in his relationship to state, society, and nature that persists in communist practice. Psychism is an admittedly awkward coinage, but it seems the best term for the phenomenon I wish to describe. Other related words, such as autism, psychologism, and voluntarism have specific meanings and would be misleading. The concept is relative, and to say that the Cultural Revolution moves in the direction of psychism is by no means to claim that everything its leaders and followers say or do fits into this category. The quest for rebirth. 33 years they have included not only youths in their early 20s or late teens but children of 13 and 14 has been striking to everyone, and then much too quickly attributed to political necessity alone. The assumption here is that, having alienated most of the more immature population by his extreme policies, Mao had no choice but to call upon the young. But I believe that one must look beyond such explanations to the wider symbolism of the Red Guard movement. According to most accounts, the Red Guards first began to appear during the early summer of 1966. Their exact origin remains obscure. One model referred to by the Chinese press is that of a group of guerrilla units during the heroic early days of the Chinese Revolution which bore the same name and were also often very young. Needless to say, there is no reference to the Red Guards of the Russian Revolution, though these were probably the original inspiration for the concept. What is certain is that the present-day People's Liberation Army has served as an important model for the emergence of the new Red Guard of China's Cultural Revolution. Only after an official public confirmation and blessing from Mao Tse-tung during a gigantic dawn rally on August 18, 1966, did the Red Guard take on national and international significance. Within a few days tens of thousands of youngsters with identifying red armbands were revolutionary mortality. 34. Roaming through Peking and, before long, the entire country. Some have viewed the Red Guard movement as a spontaneous phenomenon, a point of view encouraged by the region itself. Most Western observers take the opposite position and see it as carefully shaped throughout by knowing Maoist sculptors. What appears to have taken place is a combination of purposeful manipulation by Maoists and partly autonomous responses and decisions by leaders of Red Guard units, with all behavior profoundly influenced by the immortalizing vision animating the Cultural Revolution. Permitting a certain amount of spontaneity in this kind of movement would be in keeping with Maoist concepts of the revolutionary creativity of the masses, though such concepts would by no means preclude close control over the extent and direction of that spontaneity. The Maoists certainly were in general control of the Red Guard movement during its early months, much less so during the factional rivalries and general confusion later on. But from the beginning there was probably a good deal of emotion stimulated that went its own wave and could not be entirely managed by anyone, as is generally true of mass movements, especially when participants are very young. It is possible the Red Guard, as some have already claimed, could turn out to be a transitional entity, to be dispensed with as soon as it has outlived its usefulness. Even if this is the case, however, one must consider the meaning of the creation of a youth force at this time, and the specific functions it was called upon to serve. From the beginning the battle cry was the triumph of the quest for rebirth. 35. Out over age, of the new over the old. Hence the Net Guard's announced early goal of totally destroying the four olds, educational system in its entirety. The formation of the Red Guard was in fact closely tied in with an attack upon teachers, university officials, and educational policies, beginning at Peking University in May-June 1966. This focus upon education has been part of an effort to bring about a shift in qualities of mind that are to be esteemed and rewarded. More important than newness, as such past revolutionary virtues were honored, has been an association with youth and vitality. And the human targets selected by the young militants for mental and physical abuse were, in contrast, referred to as old fogies of the landlord and bourgeois class, the revisionist clique of old men, and, a bit later, as old men in authority and old gentlemen who follow the capitalist road. The Red Guards themselves were heralded as young people who had declared war on the old world. But in their attack upon old age and decay they were, psychologically speaking, declaring war upon death itself. The special aura of the Red Guard had to do not only with its youth but with its class purity. Its members were presented to the general public as an elite organization of youngsters charged with cleansing the entire nation. One could be admitted to their number, at least during those early days, only if one came from a family of workers, of poor peasants, of revolutionary cadres, or of members of the People's Liberation Army. With the rapid expansion of the Red Guard into a mass movement, these standards were inevitably relaxed, but its purity was nonetheless constantly contrasted with the five black categories of people selected for attack: landlords, rich peasants, counter-revolutionaries, bad elements, and rightists. From this standpoint, the August 18th rally launching the Red Guard becomes a momentous historical occasion. Western viewers of an official film of the event shown in Hong Kong and elsewhere were so impressed with the intensity of mass emotion and primal unity evoked that they have compared it to The Triumph of the Will, the Nazis' famous film of Hitler at Nuremberg. One of these observers, Franz Sherman, noting the extraordinary dawn scene of 1 million people gathered in the great square singing "The East is Red," Mao Tse, powerful in his presence though walking slowly and stiffly, then moving out among the masses on the arm of a teenage girl, went further and spoke of the formation of a new community. I would suggest that this new community, in a symbolic sense, is a community of immortals, of men, women, and children entering into a new relationship with the eternal revolutionary process. An event of this kind is meant to convey a blending of the immortal cultural and racial sub, a rather loosely used term, which in earlier campaigns has referred to various undesirable local types, including those who have connections with the underworld or with remnants of secret societies, and those who do not engage in productive work. The quest for rebirth. 37. Stance of the Chinese as a people with the equally immortal communist revolution. On other occasions as well, the Red Guard could convey an image of young people touched by grace, bestowing their anointed state upon everyone around them. A Chinese-speaking Westerner who moved freely among thousands of Red Guards during a visit to Canton in January 1967 described to me an extraordinary scene of children of 13 to 18 with beautiful faces, enjoying themselves enormously and looking exhilarated as they chanted, sang, and exhorted one another with the sayings of Mao Tse, all against a backdrop of innumerable pictures of their great leader. While there were a few older supervisors among them, the general image created was not unlike that of a children's crusade. They were a mass of youngsters unified by a transcendent vision, so infused with a sense of virtue as to be almost beatific poeticized flower children of the Cultural Revolution. But the Red Guards, as everyone knows, have also had another face. Theirs has been the task of inducing the catastrophe, of breaking and smashing, or initiating widespread agitation and disruption while spreading the message that this was what the country required. They became a strange young band of wandering zealots in search of evil and impurity. And during the first year of their existence virtually nothing and no one in China escaped their verbal or physical abuse, including at moments even Mao Tse, in whose name all of their actions were carried out. Repeatedly identifying themselves as anti-bureaucratic and anti-authority, the 38 Regard Bikatni, the means by which the Maoists uncleared the very party and state structure they had so painfully labored to create over the entire course of the Chinese Revolution. The Red Guard's symbolic mission was to kill virtually everything in order to clear the path for national rebirth, leaving only Mao and his thought as the stuff of that rebirth. Hence the wide range and often remarkable targets of Red Guard activism, especially during the summer and fall of 1966, the invasion of homes, mainly those of people in the 5 black categories, with confiscation of furniture and other possessions, the humiliation of inhabitants by verbal and sometimes physical abuse, including the ritual of parading them through the streets in dunce caps, the attacks upon temples and churches and the destruction of religious art objects as well as a certain amount of traditional and contemporary art, the cutting of hair and removing of leather shoes of Hong Kong visitors, removal from shop windows of clothes considered to be of queer and alien fashion even when Chinese-made, and the destruction of foreign-made objects of all kinds, including dolls and playing cards, the replacement of usual burial ceremonies with simple cremation, and the demand that traffic signals be reversed so that red have the properly positive connotation of go. That the order in military drill be changed from eyes right to eyes left, and that Peking itself be renamed the East is Red. To be sure, these latter demands probably resulted in nothing more than colorful great character posters, and much else in the Red Guard crusade turned out to be the quest for rebirth. 39. Rather short-lived and even improvisational. Yet the crusade had an overall consistency of spirit that was well expressed in the manifesto of one group of middle school students. We are the Red Guards of Chairman Mao and we effect the convulsion. We tear up and smash up old calendars, precious vases, US and British records, superstitious lacquers and ancient paintings, and we put up the picture of Chairman Mao. All this is seen as part of the general principle of breaking down the old and establishing the new. But since only revolutionary Maoism is eligible to be designated as new, everything else, especially that which feels un-Chinese, non-revolutionary, or simply non-Maoist, must be destroyed as old. The Red Guard was to embody and to demonstrate to all a principle of renewal and an image of perpetual youth, really perpetual life that was both revolutionary and Chinese. Whether or not accompanied by physical abuse, the verbal violence of the crusade was impressive. The literature associated with the Red Guards has abounded in gory death imagery. It has sometimes taken the form of a kind of military bravado. Demolition bombs and hand grenades will be thrown. Let what is called human affection get out of the whale, and at other times it has called forth various biological and anatomical metaphors. Non-revolutionaries are bad eggs, counter-revolution they must dig out their guts, Aries are broken eggs. Change their bones. 40. Peasant earthiness energies with extreme expressions of class antagonism. Old Uncle, young gentlemen, we tell you frankly, you all stink and you are nothing special, just rotten trash. We detest you, we shall beat, crunch them. We shall smite their dog mouths and our bayonets shall taste blood. There must be no leniency, no reconciliation. We want to settle accounts for every drop of this ocean of blood-stained hatred. Nothing will ever be forgotten. And those victimized are accused of being vampires and made to ring death bells. In this way alleged evil is linked with death. The enemy is defined as whoever denies or is opposed to the proletarian line of our party, followed by the simple statement, he will die and we will live. Beyond the simple threat, we encounter in this last expression a fundamental psychological impetus for victimization, the need to reassert one's own immortality, or that of one's group, by contrasting it with its absolute absence in one's death-tainted victim. The language used is sometimes reminiscent of the Old Testament and sometimes of 19th-century Chinese anti-missionary and anti-Christian outbursts. For this kind of extreme language, demonic, scatological, violent, hysterical, is likely to be called forth in struggles between contending modes of immortality. The process is further intensified by youthful zeal and peasant superstitiousness. Point 2 THC Quest for Rebirth. 41. Told and retold during the Satni period have been stories of heroism, of martyrs who gave their lives to combat military, industrial, cultural, or even natural enemies. The individual Red Guard was to model himself upon them and become the most recent and by far the most ambitious version of the new man in the socialist era. His privileged status was in the service of the most privileged of missions. We are graduating students, the generation that counts in the Chinese and the world revolution. He was in fact to epitomize the unlimited capacity of the community of immortals. One young man expressed this to me vividly when talking about his former Red Guard comrades. They thought themselves the greatest people in the world. They felt they could do anything. This new man is also expected to embody what Meisner calls the original bourgeois virtues: diligence, frugality, self-discipline, honesty, belief in the moral value of work, and unselfishness. Meisner views these as part of an ascetic pattern of life demanded by Chinese communist ideology. As a means by which men can transform themselves and transform nature to realize the truly human life that in Marxist theory is historically located in the socialist utopia of the future. 3. What I am suggesting is that this ascetic ideal, much like the Calvinist equivalent Meisner also mentions, is bound up with a transcendent involvement. While the Calvinists sought to establish the kingdom of God on earth, the Maoists seek a kingdom of eternal revolution. Purity and power. A key to the momentum of the Cultural Revolution is the merging of purity and power. As encompassing such things as self-denial on behalf of a higher cause, the urge to eliminate evil, and ideological single-mindedness. And we may speak of power as either the ability to make decisions and take actions that exert control and influence over others, or as the sense of inner strength and capacity. Too often an either/or situation is assumed to exist in which purity or power must be radically subservient to the other as the basic motivation for behaviors in regard to present-day China. The consensus of outside observers has been that an image of purity has been no more lurking beneath. But the assumption can be highly misleading. Rather than constituting antagonistic motivations, purity and power are in fact psychologically inseparable. Both are ultimately associated with some kind of divine, or at least more than human, image. Purity is godlike and God-given in the sense of virtue so absolute that it transcends mortal frailty, and of influences or works that outlast any individual life. Power is godlike in the more 46. Revolutionary ominous sense of hubris, of man usurping divine prerogatives, looking upon himself as a god. But in a less pejorative image, power is God-given because it is attributed either to an immortal legacy, the mandate of heaven, or divine right of kings to an individual gift for ruling in, and that is virtually superhuman. Interwoven themes of power and purity are therefore likely to dominate any collective quest for transcendence. They readily give rise to forms of ideological totalism so prominent in the Chinese Revolution. And the accompanying polarization of good and evil leads to distinctions between people and non-people, to decisions concerning which groups are entitled to exist and which are not, or to what I have called the dispensing of existence, all in the name of superior virtues. Power becomes the harnessing of purity for an immortal quest. Mao's previously quoted misgivings about the young as revolutionary heirs concern their capacity to maintain a proper combination of purity and power. And his fearful image of the death of the revolution is one of breakdown of the combination with disintegration of both elements. The Red Guards were mobilized to confront this break. These concepts are by no means the same. The divine right of kings suggests authority originating with God through the ruler's distant ancestors, and responsibility only to God. The mandate of heaven suggests a much more contingent authority, not a patent of divine right, irrevocable and eternal, conferred upon a sage king whose virtue had entitled him to act as the deputy of heaven. His descendants enjoyed it only so long as their virtue made them worthy representatives of the supreme ancestor. What the two concepts share is a stress upon a transcendent source of authority, purity, and power. 47. Down by simultaneously seizing power for the Maoists and transforming ubiquitous contamination into all-consuming purity. Two features of the Cultural Revolution epitomize this purid power constellation: the temporary use of the Paris Conelt Nun of 1871 as a model, and, much more important, the dual role of the army. The idea of the Paris Commune was consistent with the regime's long-standing communal ethos, and was a means of extending that ethic from the countryside to the city. Images surrounding the Paris Commune, although apparently used ambivalently and experimentally, may have nonetheless influenced the general course of the Cultural Revolution. Point 3 For the Paris Commune has always had a spéciale mystique for communist movements throughout the world. Its early occurrence and heroic circumstances, and the later commentaries on it by Marx, Engels, and Lenin, have given it a quasi-sacred aura within the sequence of Marxist history. These commentaries dealt with both sides of the constellation we have been discussing, the achievement of proletarian purity by means of collective revolutionary action, and the question of seizure of power. Like the Cultural Revolution, the Paris Commune stressed the theme of the farmed populace, the idea of militant unprofessionals, two aspects of the mission. It was Marx himself who pointed out the immortalizing nature of the Paris Commune when he said that it admitted all foreigners to the honor of dying for an immortal cause. These days it would be difficult to read such a passage without a sense of irony, except perhaps in China. 48. And the Chinese did indeed use similar language in reference to the Shanghai Commune in February 1967, when they spoke of the birth of a new Paris Commune in the people of 60s of this century. Shanghai have been liberated a second time, and which would be eternal and indestructible. Their estimate turned out to be a bit premature, since the life of the Shanghai Commune, like that of many institutional arrangements during the Cultural Revolution, turned out to be a very short one. But the point here is the Shanghai Commune's ideal of perfect fusion of power and purity through absolute proletarianization, total elimination of bureaucratic and bourgeois contamination, and close attention to the task of prevailing militarily and politically over one's opponents. The People's Liberation Army provides an even more striking contemporary purity power model. The Army's own Cultural Revolution preceded that of the rest of the country, and set the tone and idiom for the national movement with emphasis upon the almost legendary achievements of the Red Army in the past. Thus, Red Guards could refer to a journey to Peking from a distant part of. There was even a parallel during the Cultural Revolution to Marx's statement about foreigners. Mao's essay In Memory of Norman Bethune, originally written in 1939, was given great stress as one of the 3 constantly read articles, and in it Mao speaks of this Canadian physician who served with the Chinese Communist Army as having died a martyr at his post. Mao then asks, what kind of spirit is this that makes a foreigner selflessly adopt the cause of the Chinese people's liberation as his own? It is the spirit of internationalism, the spirit of communism, from which every Chinese communist must learn. Purity and power. 49. China as a long march. Maoist functionaries became so infused with this military idiom that they extended it to social and economic areas and would capital formation as a treat type of guerrilla warfare. 5. And when leading Peking opera repertory groups came under attack by Mao himself as still under the mule of the dead, their road of reform was incorporation into the great school for the great thought of Mao Tse, the Chinese People's Liberation Army. Through this blend of art and army, Mao's wife, the former film actress Chiang Kai-shek, emerged from relative obscurity to take a surprisingly active part in the Cultural Revolution. From the outset the ultimate ethic held out to the nation was that of the brave soldier inspired to superhuman sacrifices by the thought of Mao Tse, then dying willingly and heroically for the revolution with Mao's words on his lips. And groups associated with the army offer instruction to virtually the entire population in communist morality and ethics. There is no ignoring the obvious political benefit, indeed, as things turned out, necessity of backing up the desired psychic state with military strength. Nor did the army itself, or for that matter its Red Guard emulators, turn out to be totally pure. Both remained under the general control of the Maoist group, but experienced a va. There was something of a historical precedent for this, as the famed 8th Route Army is said to have served a similar function in Yan'an and the border areas from about 1938 to 1945. But that was in the midst of civil war, when virtually everybody had to be part of the army, in contrast to the much more differentiated society in which the army offers instruction today. 50. Variety of factional struggles and conflicts involving Maoists, anti-Maoists, and indeterminate units and subdivisions. Moreover, the army's entry into the Triple Alliance could be said to represent a certain amount of backtracking from the purist model of the Paris Commune, which the alliance actually replaced. The same may be said of the increasing hegemony of the army within the alliance itself, to the extent of sometimes rendering it virtually a form of military rule. Yet while the resistance Mao encountered made it necessary for him to resort increasingly to military force, that force, from the beginning of the Cultural Revolution, had been intimately associated with revolutionary purity with combined psychic and material power. Precisely this combination has been prominent all through Chinese communist practice. An excellent example is the thought reform process, long a trademark of Chinese communism, with its group-mediated psychological pressures toward ideological conversion. One could view the process as a carrot-and-stick application of power for the purpose of controlling behavior using various kinds of coercion and threat, together with the promise that those properly reformed will merge with and partake deeply of the invincible revolutionary force. But one could also view it as a method of individual purification which, by means of detailed self-examination, provides benefits akin to those of psychotherapy and spiritual enlightenment. The Triple Alliance includes revolutionary mass organizations such as the Red Guard and Revolutionary Rebels, pro-Maoist cadres, and the People's Liberation Army. Purity and power. 51. Thought reform has, at various times and for different individuals, been both. All of its elements have been perpetuated with new intensity during the Cultural Revolution, the familiar insistence that the sick be cured, that they lighten their burdens and obtain merits to redeem their crimes, and the endless public accusations, self-criticisms, and confessions. We shall soon note the psychological pitfalls of the thought reform program as applied during the Cultural Revolution, but there is no denying the potential impact of its particular ingredients. Its attractive purity backed by coercive power. One could equally say attractive power backed by coercive purity undoubtedly evokes strong feelings of self-condemnation, encompassing both guilt and shame, in many of those failing to meet the extreme standards of the environment. Such feelings can culminate in a terrifying anxiety of extinction, related less to biological death per se than to a sense of being cut off from all human connection and rendered totally inert and insignificant. Purity and power merge in the language of the two leaders of the Cultural Revolution, Mao Tse and Lin Piao, the latter through quotation and paraphrase often serving as the voice of the former. Lin Piao thus states, "All our work is preparation for war, and also, the best weapon of our troops is not the airplane, cannon, tank, or atomic bomb, but the thought of Mao Tse. The greatest fighting force is man armed with the thought of Mao Tse, daring, not afraid of death." Lin and 52. Others frequently quoted statements by Mao to the effect that war can be abolished only by war, and in order to get rid of the gun it is necessary to take up the gun, and the world can be changed only by using gun barrels. What this language suggests is the principle that ultimate purity requires application of ultimate power, but that purity as such remains the source of that power. Indeed is ultimate power because he who possesses it has conquered death. The Mao-Lin combination can itself be said to symbolize just this kind of fusion. Nihil Mao may be considered to embody both purity and power. He has achieved a status within revolutionary lore as godlike in wisdom and virtue. Lin, although associated with revolutionary education and reform, is the essence of the successful military man, his aura of power deriving not only from long-standing army leadership but from close recent identification with the making and testing of nuclear weapons. And during the Cultural Revolution both men have stood not only for the much publicized motto "Seize Power," but for the related one, "Seize the Revolution." The latter much more significant because of its implicit suggestion of noble purpose and enduring consequence. The mass line and the almost identical red line are ideological manifestations of a similar blend. They have been employed, at times loosely and at times with the most narrow precision, to provide criteria for acceptable behavior during the Cultural Revolution, just as they did during earlier campaigns and in everyday life in communal purity and power. 53. NIST China. But in terms of feeling, they evoke a more mystical sense of immortal revolutionary substance, and serve as a guide for an individual's becoming and remaining part of that substance. Moreover, the Cultural Revolution has stressed a nobilization of purity through China's power of numbers visions of 700 million Chinese all following the mass line and achieving the peasant and worker viewpoint, which is another way of combining revolutionary substance with the eternal substance of the Chinese race and culture. A related issue is the heightening during the Cultural Revolution of the long-standing Chinese communist preoccupation with being read as distinct from expert. This seemingly simple polarity reflects a crucial confrontation between revolutionary purity and modern technology. Without pausing just yet to explore this confrontation, we may say that the extreme Maoist glorification of redness and undermining of expertness for a time so threatened the last vestiges in China of dispassionate intellectual endeavor as to virtually eliminate the intellectuals as a functioning group. Involved here is the implicit assumption that the special revolutionary combination of purity and power could in itself completely nourish the individual mind, and that any additional intellectual needs were suspect. In the delineation of purity, great stress was placed upon 54 revolutionary jm Stortily what could be considered rural and Chinese as opposed to the threatening impurities of the urban and the foreign. While the Red Guards first appeared in Peking, they can to include Nani youths from outside the large cities and in general tried to take on a rural coloring. They made repeated journeys to the countryside and placed great stress upon learning from the peasants and becoming little students of the masses, these two slogans having been prominent in the preceding socialist education movement, which sent large numbers of intellectuals to rural areas to imbibe the wisdom of the Chinese earth and its tillers. Here we sense a restorationist impulse, the Maoist attempt to recapture a form of harmony felt to exist in the past among people close to the earth until contaminated by the complexities of modern existence. What of the shift in target, within a month or two after the Red Guards came into being, from class enemies to those in authority? Once it became clear that none other than the head of state, Liu Xiaochi, was to become the object of extreme vituperation, many observers concluded that here was the answer to the mystery of the Cultural Revolution, the entire point of the operation. But even if this form of harmony and purity is consistent with the spirit of Yan'an, not to mention that of Rousseau, but it is also consistent with various millenary visions of traditional and modern Chinese thinkers, who, in characteristic restorationist fashion, find their models in a mythical golden age of the past. The larger or great harmony sought in these visions should be distinguished from the more humble everyday Chinese cultural principle of harmonious human relationships, based upon proper attention to rights, principles, and compromise, though the two would seem to have considerable psychological relationship. Purity and Power 55 One assumes that Mao and Lin Ivad planned from the outset to unclean Liu's authority, and that this goal greatly influenced the tone and scope of the Cultural Revolution. One must still ask why it became so important to get rid of Liu. What was there about this rivalry for power that could cause a revolutionary movement with an extraordinary 45-year record of organizational accomplishment prior and subsequent to its assumption of national power, to embark upon a series of actions directly undermining the authority it had so laboriously built up? It seems clear that Liu, during the decade prior to the Cultural Revolution, emerged as a leading voice among the pragmatists who opposed Mao and sought to limit his power. There is also some evidence that a group of high party officials might have contemplated a coup d'état. Even if this is true, however, one does not know whether Liu was in any way connected with it. But again, I would insist that we avoid the solipsistic assumption that in such situations men act only out of motives totally centered upon the individual self, that is, out of petty jealousies. Rather, one must assume that Liu came to feel that curbing Mao's power was necessary for the revolution, just as we know Mao and his followers to have come to believe that revitalizing the revolution required that Liu and his influence be destroyed. In other words, the individual urge to wield power is associated with a formulation which connects that power to worthy purposes extending beyond both the self and the historical moment. Nor can such a formulation be dismissed as mere rationalization of personal ambition. For ambition itself is bound up with a larger vision, a controlling image of self and world, for Lu an image of demaoization and a pragmatic course of consolidation, for Mao one of heroic national struggle including a spirit that the Chinese themselves call revolutionary romanticism. Whatever the extent of personal antagonism between the two men, their power struggle is enmeshed in questions of purity. Maoist anxiety arises less from the prospect of the revolution falling into the hands of a different leader, which must in any case inevitably happen, than from the possibility that the new leader will espouse an alternative and therefore impure revolutionary vision. In such instances judgments become retroactive. 4.5 decades of shared revolutionary experience extending from heroic early days through turbulent recent accomplishments, as well as regional bonds so important in Chinese culture, all this must give way to a new Maoist claim that Lu had always possessed hidden inclinations toward capitalism. The same applies to Liu's celebrated pamphlet How to be a Good Communist. Long a sourcebook for the self-cultivation of generations of party cadres, its forceful combination of Confucianist and Leninist tones always regarded as highly Maoist, it now becomes the work of a traitor which has poisoned the minds of innumerable innocent comrades. Do Mao and his followers really believe this? Or do they coolly regard their own denunciations as no more than necessary political maneuvers? From what I have learned about the behavior of men in such situations and about the psychology of belief in general, I Purity and Power 57 would suspect that both tendencies coexist. A sense of tactical necessity merges with the accuser's partial commitment to his own accusations. But the inner logic is taught to us. And the kinds of judgments made are precisely those which can be equally rapidly reversed once Mao's hegemony has ended. Yet the original condemnation is felt to be necessary because, in the psychological language we have been using, once a man and his vision are perceived as destroyers of revolutionary immortality, so must be all of his works. Crucial to the blending of power and purity because it confirming the importance of elements beyond the self in the struggle between communist leaders is the fact that the attack upon Lu has had a highly symbolic quality. Rather than seeking to punish or eliminate Lu, that is, either put him to death or imprison him, Maoists have preferred to condemn him as a dangerous example of the kind of deadly impurity that could affect anyone. Throughout the attack upon him he was referred to as the top party person taking the capitalist road, or China's Khrushchev. Not until March 1968, months after the collective passions of the Cultural Revolution had subsided, was his actual name reportedly mentioned, and even then not on a public occasion but at a meeting with a Japanese trade delegation presided over by Zhou Enlai. This specific identification led some observers to believe that the Slaoists were ready to go ahead with a political purge and possibly with some form of punitive accession. There is some precedent in Chinese tradition for this form of symbolic attack. It was, for instance, utilized by Boxer leaders in 1900 in their public humiliation of members of Allied Legations. 58. Draws directly upon both is the question of autonomy. Even if the masses, when called upon to organize their own strength, were actually being manipulated from above, Anvani could nonetheless experience a feeling of awakened individual significance. I have mentioned the sense of unlimited capacity or power in many Red Guards during the more enthusiastic moments of the Cultural Revolution. Along with revolutionary rebels and related groups, they roamed the cities and countryside in 1966 and 1967, attacking alleged class enemies, spreading terror among foreign diplomatic communities, and then turning their wrath upon their own men in authority who take the capitalist road, right on up to the head of state. We suspect that they experienced a rare sense not only of participating in a great moral crusade but of taking matters into their own hands. They could also share in a sense of dramatic reversal of past intimidation and humiliation, at the hands of foreign powers, of landlords and capitalists, and of Communist Party bureaucrats. 14th century historical novel which has been translated into English as Renaissance of the Three Kingdoms. In one sense, then, the Cultural Revolution was an ex-hilarity, the great struggles between man and between man and nature. They could at least momentarily eliminate painful vestiges of enforced dependency and helplessness. The paradox is that collective autonomy of this kind results from the totalistic attack upon any signs of the independent self. Any violation of the individual becomes acceptable if in the service of the larger vision. as a Red Guard was once quoted as saying, "So long as it is revolutionary, no action is a crime's the goal of each person," the Chinese press made clear, was to become a stain. The other side of the Chinese bureaucratic impulse has been the extraordinary organizational accomplishments it has brought about, the governing of so vast and populous a society according to consistent ethical and legal standards. But such a bureaucratic emphasis is bound to give rise to potentially explosive antagonist stunts. The communist bureaucracy has apparently been prone to abuses and forms of self-indulgence comparable to those of its traditional predecessors, and some of the Maoist condemnation of it is reminiscent of Milovan-Djilas' attack upon the privileged communist new class. 60 Revolutionary Immortality less screw in the locomotive of revolution. Each was, new, re-over, warned to beware of the danger of unauthentic claimants to noble ideals to tear off the liberty, equality, fraternity loincloth of the bourgeois class. For should class enemies be permitted any liberties, they become smiling tigers, and one must remember that smiling tigers can eat people. The great dread is that the revolution will be devoured in this fashion, that China will change color and take the capitalist revisionist road. But since it is an ultimate confrontation between good and evil, a life and death struggle on which the fate of the world depends, a sense of ultimate purity and ultimate power beckon to the individual participant. Even if he cut himself off from all but the most ritualistic Maoist images, he could feel a new autonomy as he merged with his people, his history, his revolution. The Maoist demand for absolute selflessness and denunciation of the concept of self-interest, selfishness, advancing one's own interest at the expense of others, and extreme individualism as the kernel of the bourgeois world outlook finds some cultural echoes in the traditional Chinese stress upon subjugating the individual to prevailing collective standards. But in its more extreme expressions, Maoism leaves considerably less room for certain forms of individual maneuver traditionally permitted under the concept of consideration for human feelings. 6. The immortalization of words. YTITV-.:a. How are we to understand that remarkable entity, the thought of Mao Tse? The man and his words fused into a powerful image, which became the essence of revolutionary immortality as well as the energizer for its quest. This is by no means the first time that a political leader has been made into a divinity. But few in the past could have matched Mao in the superlatives used, the number of celebrants, or the thoroughness with which the message of glory has been disseminated. Even more unique has been the way in which the leader's words have become vehicles for elevating him, during his lifetime, to a place above that of the state itself or its institutional source of purity and power, in this case the party. And the process is rendered this is in violation of the Stalinist precedent of viewing the leader as subservient to and an instrument of the ultimate historical authority of the party. One would have to go back to Lenin or possibly Marx to find communist analogies to this aspect of the Maoist image, and their deification differed both in being a retrospective historical phenomenon that had to await their deaths, and in being less directly related to specific quotations from their writings. But if one compares Mao to a traditional Chinese emperor, his position becomes that of a Confucian ruler whose 64. All the more impressive by the opposite tendency predominant throughout the world, the desacralization of men, words, and virtually everything else. Rather than resort to the tone of uneasy contempt so frequent in Western observers, we do better to take a closer look at some of the psychological and historical currents involved. All cultures have a way of rendering sacred the word, and none more than China. Relevant here is the Confucian focus upon the name as a means of ordering all human life. The traditional principle of rectification of names required not only that each live according to the rules governing his category of existence, but that where disparity existed, the man undergo whatever moral change was required for him to fit the name. As Granite has written, the name possesses the individual rather than the individual can transform many things or clear the way for their transformation. There is Mao's proud declaration, yes, we are advocates of the omnipotence of revolutionary war, that is good, not bad, it is Marxist. Here omnipotence refers on one level to policy priority, but on another to a sense of unlimited revolutionary power called forth by the purifying experience of facing death on behalf of a just cause. This sentiment is repeated in another chapter, which stresses what is probably the most famous of all Maoist zero. The second meaning, namely important, is also conveyed by the original Chinese term tung, translated as weight. Similarly, the Chinese term for light, ching, also means unimportant. 68. Images as revealed in its title, Imperialism and all Resetionaries are paper tigers. An extract from a speech made in Moscow in 1957 is notable. I have said that all the reputedly powerful reactionaries are merely paper tigers. The reason is that they are divorced from the people. Look. Was not Hitler a paper tiger? Was Hitler not overthrown? I also said that the Tsar of Russia, the Empress of China, and Japanese imperialism were all paper tigers. As we know, they were all overthrown. US imperialism has not yet been overthrown, and it has the atom bomb. I believe it also will be overthrown. It, too, is a paper tiger. We can begin to see that the paper tiger image is meant to suggest a fundamental hollowness and weakness associated with the absence of immortal revolutionary substance. Therefore, the psychic logic goes, these hollow enemies should pose no threat to the Maoist possessor of that immortal substance. Above all, one need not fear death at the hands of the enemy, as suggested in a passage published originally in 1938 in an important military volume, Basic Tactics. When we see the enemy, we must not be frightened to death like a rat who sees a cat, simply because he has a weapon in his hands. We must not be afraid of approaching him or infiltrating into his midst in order to carry out sabotage. We are men, the enemy is also composed of men, we are all men, so what should we fear? The fact that he has weapons. We can find the way to seize his weapons. All we are afraid of is getting killed by the enemy. But when we undergo the oppression of the enemy to such a point as this, how can anyone still fear death? And the immortalization of words. 69. If we do not fear death, then what is there to fear about the enemy? So when we see the enemy, whether he is many or few, we must act as though HC is bread that can satisfy our hunger, and immediately follow him. Underneath the assumption of oppression being worse than death is a characteristically Maoist tone of transcendence, a message to the revolutionary which seems to say, that death does not really exist for him, he has absolutely nothing to fear. Mao put forth this message as early as 1919 in the midst of the stirrings of cultural and political revolution associated with the epochal May 4th movement. What is the greatest force? The greatest force is that of the union of the popular masses. What should we fear? We should not fear heaven. We should not fear ghosts. We should not fear the dead. We should not fear the bureaucrats. We should not fear the militarists. We should not fear the capitalists. To eliminate awe of seemingly powerful enemies, Mao adopts an attitude of general leveling and immortalization. But this leveling is mere prelude to claiming that immortal status for his own revolutionary group, and declaring its consequent immunity to the emanations from ordinary arbiters of life and death, supernatural and historical. The revolutionary, then, can wholeheartedly resolve to fight to the death to kill the enemy. A leader who can instill these transcendent principles in his followers can turn the most extreme threat and dissent. 70. Revolutionary Immortality Gration into an ordered certainty of mission, convert the inast incapacitating death anxiety into a death-conquering kin of near invincibility. IE can in fact become the ornipotent geekle sought by all totalist movements, precisely the annealing of the characterization of Mao during the Cultural Revolution as the great leader, great teacher, great supreme commander, and great helmsman. The thought of Mao becomes not so much an exact blueprint for the future as a way, a call to a particular mode of being on behalf of a transcendent purpose. Behind this way are two psychological assumptions long prominent in Mao's thought but never so overtly insisted upon as during the Cultural Revolution. The first is an image of the human mind as infinitely malleable, capable of being reformed, transformed, and rectified without limit. The second is a related vision of the will as all-powerful, even to the extent that the subjective creates the objective. That is, man's capacity for both undergoing change and changing his zero. Franz Sherman somewhat similarly refers to Mao's thought as practical ideology rather than pure ideology. By practical ideology he means a combination of Marxist-Leninist theory and everyday practice. Sherman views Mao's thought as highly flexible and changeable according to the immediate problems confronted, but what I am referring to is less ideology as such than a quality of feeling, a tenor of action, a form of relating to the world. Thus, what I call Mao's existential absolute and the way he has charted around it are not open-ended or subject to change. They may vary in intensity from time to time, but they have been strikingly consistent in Mao's revolutionary style and throughout his adult life in general. The Immortalization of words. 71. Environment is unlimited. Once he makes the decision for change, the entire universe can be bent to his will. Blit again, the controlling energy is the sense of revolutionary immortality that confers these vaulting capacities upon the mind. And the key to psychic malleability and power, the central purpose of the thought reform process, is the replacement of prior modes of immortality not determined to change heaven and tigers behind earth, fight the enemy, stick to the truth. Such dedication and courage are indeed possible insofar as one can genuinely worship Mao's thought along lines suggested by still another passage, which could well be viewed as the epitome of the immortalization of the word and all who embrace it. The thought of Mao Tse is the sun in our heart, is the root of our life, is the source of all our strength. Through this, man becomes unselfish, daring, intelligent, able to do everything. He is not conquered by any difficulty and can conquer every enemy. The thought of Mao Tse transforms man's ideology, transforms the fatherland. Through this the oppressed people of the world will rise. The Maoist corpus is elevated to an all-consuming prophet. It nurtures men, predicts their future, and changes the world to accomplish its own prediction. It sets in motion spiritual forces against which nothing can stand. At times a hallowed thought sequence is suggested from Marx to Mao, sometimes via Lenin and possibly Stalin, then continuing from Mao to Lin. Mao is said to have creatively applied Marx's thought and Lin to have done the same to Mao's, but the implication is that the first was a transformation achieved by a genius and the second. 74. No inner than the fidelity of a loyal disciple. The important thing is that the immortal corpus have continuity with past and future, that it be universal. The light of the thoughts of Mao shines on the whole world. And that to resist it is tantamount to being annihilated. To oppose the thought of Mao Tse is to destroy oneself like a moth flying over a flame. This verbal genuflection before Mao has undoubtedly at times taken on qualities of tired ritual, a cliché for all occasions. And the staggering claims often made in the Chinese press for the application of these thoughts contribute to the instant ridicule with which they have been so widely greeted. Yet here again the matter bears closer scrutiny. The most famous target of ridicule was the insistence, early in the Cultural Revolution, that the thoughts of Mao had been responsible for China's brilliant successes in international table tennis competition, and the mockery knew no bounds when the news came out later that the world champion himself had been strongly criticized for various shortcomings and eventually arrested. But M. Rufford Harrison, president of the United States Table Tennis Association, was considerably less derisive in his commentary. The writings and spirit of Mao invade every match the Chinese play. The national team, before beginning play, recite Mao quotations to give them courage, and in the middle of a tense game a Chinese crowd will often chant Mao sayings to spur their heroes on. It has a terrific side, the immortalization of words. 75. Ecological effect, seeming to drive them to feats of endurance and other exceptional efforts. If we assume that Mr. Harrison speaks not as a Maoist but merely as an accurate observer, we are obliged to conclude that embracing the immortal corpus can indeed inspire unusual effort and accomplishment. We may suspect similar combinations of ritualistic cliché and authenticity in widely disseminated claims of the marvelous contributions of Mao's thought to such large tasks as the drilling of oil wells, the construction of great modern airports, and the completion in record time of highly advanced and elaborate equipment for the steel industry. And when we are told how villagers, in true Maoist fashion, have transformed heaven and earth in achieving enormous victories over wind, sand, flood, and drought, there is no reason for us to doubt that some of the people involved in these projects felt energized by the Maoist phrases being chanted any more than we would doubt that many who did not said that they did. Concerning the claim that Mao's thought was responsible for the unexpectedly early completion and successful testing of a hydrogen bomb, we have reason to believe that the major contribution of Maoism was to leave the nuclear scientists alone. But who is to say that none of them and none of the technicians and soldiers later praised for their courageous achievements in entering the test area to evaluate the bomb's effects were sustained at all by the death-defying Maoist images we have discussed? The slogan used on that occasion when men listen to this chairman, machinery listens to men in 76. Become a dangerous simplification for a regime bent on industrialization. Indeed, as we shall soon observe, the entire Maoist progranelle has foundered on it. All the same, men in a variety of situations could feel themselves strengthened by allying themselves to such an immortal corpus. The procedure to be followed, as first applied in the army and then throughout the country, was laid down by Lin Piao. Study with a question in mind, living study and living use, study and use combined. YV use is urgent, study first, set up the stick and look at the shadow. The stick of Mao's thought, in other words, sends off the shadow or guideline for the task at hand. Lin on another occasion spoke of the thought of Mao as the great spiritual strength which will change into a great material force in itself, a very Maoist way of viewing it. And whatever the purposeful use of such an image by Lin or its intrinsic exaggeration, we still do well to take the rhetoric seriously and recognize that the thought of any leader, certainly of this one, is convertible into material power, at least to a certain extent. Highly instructive on the issue of psychological and physical benefits is an article by a military athlete entitled "The Power of Mao Tse-tung's Thought is Infinite." For a time I suffered seriously from a nervous breakdown. My head ached in the daytime, I could not sleep at night, and I lacked energy. However, the thought of Mao, the inunortalization of words. 77. Tse-tung gave northeast unlineal strength. It gave me a greater courage to overcome difficulties. I made great effort in study and training. With such strength I finally surmounted all difficulties, continually raised my technical level, and broke a number of national records. The tone here seems to combine that of the religious convert and the enthusiastic beneficiary of psychotherapy. While religious converts backslide and psychiatric patients tend to modify initial enthusiasms, it is within the bounds of scientific possibility to assume that faith in the efficacy of Mao's thought, a sense of sharing in its immortalizing power, could have influences very much like those the athlete described. Evangelists and psychiatrists have done as much, one may claim, with a good deal less. But it is in the nature of the Maoist corpus child that it is of the excesses of the Cultural Revolution to overstep itself and move toward an ideological abyss, as suggested in a statement by Lin Piao quoted before. The best weapon of our troops is not the airplane, cannon, tank, or atomic bomb, but the thought of Mao Tse-tung. The greatest fighting force is the man armed with the thought of Mao Tse-tung, daring, not afraid of death. In the same spirit, Mao's thought is said to articulate the final struggle between the world's two major forces, revolution and counter-revolution. It is held to be the key to the revolutionization of man. The inspiration for the heroes have aptly said, "We must live for the people and die for the people." A revolutionary has no fear of death, and one who fears death is no revolutionary. Now the message is, so Potkofel has the MJ Nordal. 78. Corpus render us that we become absolute conquerors of inan, technology, and death. One might be tempted to dismiss the entire cult of Mao and his thought as no more than sycophantic indulgence of an old man's vanity, were it not for the life Mao has lived and the impact he has made upon the Chinese people. He has in fact come close to living out precisely the kind of existential absolute he has advocated. No 20th century life has come closer than his to the great myth of the hero with its road of trials, or prolonged death encounter, and its mastery of that encounter in a way that enhances the life of one's people. His message of mastery of death anxiety, reinforced by personal example, took on special relevance for a people living through a period in which such anxiety was continuously mobilized by extreme dislocation, violence, and loss. During such times there is always a hunger for words and acts that contribute to the reordering and resymbolization of collective existence. At a more personal level, we have noted Mao's preoccupation with his own series of survivals of intimate family members and revolutionary comrades. Mao's first wife and their son, his younger sister, and his two younger brothers all met violent deaths while serving the Chinese Commu have elsewhere suggested 7 that this theme of conquering death is more central to the myth of the hero than is the Oedipus complex, which Freud and other early psychoanalytic writers sasp as the key to the myth. The immortalization of words. 79. Nist movement. Mao lost his last sibling when his brother Mao Tse was executed in 1943 by a warlord, and since he had actively guided and directed his brother's revolutionary career, this death must have engendered in him especially strong feelings of what I have elsewhere called guilt over survival priority. There is much evidence that Mao felt very strongly not only about these losses but about the manner in which they occurred. He has frequently revealed unusual sensitivity to death imagery in general and to survivor guilt in particular. But rather than being incapacitated by such feelings, he has, in the manner of all great leaders, applied them to the larger historical crises of his day. Significantly, 2 of the 3 constantly read articles so intensively focused upon during the Cultural Revolution were written in commemoration of individual deaths. Serve the People was originally a speech delivered by Mao at a memorial meeting for Chiang Su-te, a soldier of the Guard Regiment of the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party, and in the essay Mao uses the soldier's death as a prototype for the general principle of dying for an immortal cause. In Memory of Norman Bethune was written only about 5 weeks after the death of the Canadian surgeon. And the third essay, while not specifically commemorative, has direct bearing on issues of symbolic immortality. It is entitled The Foolish Old Man Who Removed the Mountains, and it takes from Chinese folklore the story of an old man of North China who, because the way from his house was obstructed by 2 great mounds, led his sons in digging up the tains, with great determination mountains, hoe in hand. When told he was foolish he replied, "When I die, my sons will carry on, when they die, there will be my grandsons, and then their sons and grandsons, and so on to infinity. Why can't we dig away?" Finally, Cod 80 revolutionary immortality. One could draw upon a number of illustrative examples. For instance, in 1919, when Mao was still a little-known apprentice revolutionary editing a periodical in Changsha, a young girl of that city, whose parents had forced her to marry against her will, committed suicide. Mao was sufficiently moved by the incident to write 9 newspaper articles in 13 days denouncing the old society's restrictions upon individual liberty and anticipating a future great wave of the freedom to love. Leaving aside the historical irony of his own later imposition of restrictions in many ways greater than those he condemned as a young libertarian, we note his unusually strong reaction to an individual death. Here and on other occasions he could embrace a form of death guilt that could be put to social use. We may speak of this as an activist response to death, whether the death be of an immediate biological kind or of the more symbolic kind exemplified by chaos and injustice. The necessary combination for this response is full openness to death anxiety and death guilt, and an immediate transcendence of these emotions through linking them directly was moved, and he sent down 2 angels, who carried the mountains away on their backs. Mao goes on to say that imperialism and feudalism are 2 big mountains like a dead weight on the Chinese people, and that our God is none other than the masses of the Chinese people. Though the speech was given in 1945 when Mao was in his early 50s and by no means an old man, it is a perfect parable of both revolutionary immortality and Mao's own involvement in the quest. The immortalization of words. 81 to revolutionary struggles. And without attempting to detail Mao's remarkable achievements, we may say that this combination has greatly contributed to his revitalizing talents as a peasant organizer, military strategist, party leader, head of state, and general theorist in the signification of Marxism. Mao's relationship to the myth of the hero is also enhanced by certain qualities of personal and revolutionary style that reveal a man closely attuned to the pulse of immortality. One such trait is his celebrated revolutionary romanticism, a designation which would sound highly derogatory to most communist ears but which official Chinese commentaries have associated with courage in the face of objective difficulties, and with great revolutionary vision, and by his general affinity for outlaws, and for the romantic aura often bestowed by Chinese tradition upon outlaws as noble subverters of prevailing social evil. For such reasons a Chinese writer once called Mao fundamentally a character from a Chinese novel or opera. And Stuart Scram speaks of his military romanticism, by which he means Mao's tendency to regard war as the supreme adventure and the supreme test of human courage and human will, along with the warlike quality of his temperament and imagination post-economic and even scientific and philosophical problems in these terms. 9. Mao's revolutionary romanticism, then, is the hero's quest for doing more than the possible, risking and even courting death in order to alter the meaning of both life and death, storming heaven and challenging the claims of existing deities, political as well as theological, in order to replace them with the claims of revolutionary immortality. Associated with this romantic affinity for transcendence have been some of Mao's greatest. Mao frequently impressed others as a man with a heroic mission. On the basis of their 1936 meeting, Snow wrote, "Undeniably you feel a certain force of destiny in him, nothing quick or flashy, but a kind of solid elemental vitality, and Mao Tse may possibly become a very great man." Snow's further comments touched upon the hero's capacity to conquer death. Mao has the reputation of a charmed life. Il has been repeatedly pronounced dead by Nanking, only to return to the news columns a few days later, as active as there seems to be some basis for the legend of his ever-charmed life, however, in the fact that, although he has been in scores of battles, was once captured by enemy troops and escaped, and has had the world's highest reward on his head, during all of these years he has never once been wounded. 10. The immortalization of my arts. 83. Achievements as well as his most spectacular failures. A closely related psychological and historical pattern is his extreme identification with or what has been called his mystical faith in the Chinese rural masses. Some observers have attributed this simply to Mao's own peasant background, but in 1936 Edgar Snow noted a combination of peasant-like qualities and the most incisive wit and worldly sophistication. 11. Mao's relationship to his peasant background is undoubtedly more complex than usually recognized. Having rebelled against a father who had himself risen from a poor peasant to a middle or rich peasant category, we may suspect that Mao's passionate glorification of the peasant state permitted him to channel ambivalent emotions of affection and resentment toward that state into a formulation that was both revolutionary and Chinese. In any case, he perceived very early the special significance of peasant power for Chinese communism and for the country's future. In the process he evolved an identification that rooted him firmly in China's cultural and racial substance, and a quality of concern for her national destiny even to the point of marked sinocentrisme. From the time of his youth Mao has resisted numerous opportunities to travel abroad, and it is nothing less than extraordinary that during his long life he has spent only a total of about 1 month away from Chinese soil, during 84. 2 brief trips to Moscow in 1949 and 1957. Many have noted the political significance of his lifelong concern with Chinese dignity. The nature of this preoccupation is strikingly revealed in a few seemingly inconsequential vignettes recorded by Scram. Mao as a young man in Shanghai in 1924, dressed in old Chinese clothes, coming across a former schoolmate dressed in Western style whom he promptly tells to change his suit, and when asked why says, "I'll show you," and leads his friend to the infamous sign in a nearby park, "Chinese and dogs are not allowed." Mao at an even earlier age as a spectator at a soccer game in which one of the contestants was yelling China suddenly rising from the crowd and shouting "Beat the slaves of foreign ers." Mao the scatological lyricist denouncing the Chinese government's subservience to the West with the pithy observation, "If one of our foreign masters farts, it's a lovely perfume." It becomes clear that from the time of his youth Mao has felt himself deeply involved in a struggle to restore national pride which over the years became nothing less than a heroic quest to reassert the life power of China. Hence, Mao came to associate communism with the timeless virtues of the peasant masses and of the Chinese earth. And his relentless pursuit of the thought reform process in marked contrast. Most prominent Asian revolutionaries of his generation spent years abroad during which, in many cases, their political visions, attitudes toward the West, and personal identities were significantly shaped. The immortalization of words. 85. Has been an effort to cement this association, especially within the minds of intellectuals. Mao once described his communist movement as passionately concerned with the fate of the Chinese nation, and moreover with its fate throughout all eternity. 12:1 recalls Mao's ringing declaration, upon his victorious assumption of power in 1949, that China had stood up and would never again be an insulted nation, an expression of national resurgence which was as authentically Maoist as it was Chinese. Rather than speak of Mao as a father figure or mother figure for his countrymen, we do better to see him as a death-conquering hero who became the embodiment of Chinese immortality. Mao himself seems to experience inwardly this heroic fusion of man and nature in his special style of historical preoccupation, a mythical cast of thought within which the great men and the villains of the past were familiar and contemporary, and what was happening now was indeed a natural sequel to a much older drama. So much so that one was left with the feeling that history was habitat, from the first Chinese dynasty on, and that he felt close kinship to 130 only such a singular all the great rebels of the past. Capacity to identify himself with Chinese cultural and historical substance could have led Mao to pursue the outrageous extremes of the Cultural Revolution. It is as if he were attempting to establish the conviction that China's heroic dimensions, her great history, vast land, stagger this tendency to bestow upon the distant past great psychological force and immediacy is to some extent a Chinese cultural trait, but one apparently present in Mao to an unusual degree. Ing population, Ang legendary revolution render her immune to the dangers of the contemporary world and to the limitations of Hunan existence. Mao's romantic channels to immortality are nowhere in evidence than in his special way with words. While he can at times be as mundane as any other propagandist, and the rhetoric about him can be worse than that, there is no denying his talent for the reverberating phrase. This often takes the form of the especially apt use of a Chinese folk saying, as in the case of his Bai Nao Fa Mao slogan, "The east wind prevails over the west wind." When he first uttered the phrase in Moscow in 1957, he was understood to mean the political east or the socialist camp, and only later did it come to signify the geographical and racial east. But there can be little doubt that the second set of meanings was present at least potentially from the beginning, and that at some psychic level east wind referred to Chinese cultural revolutionary substance. The impact of the metaphor is further enhanced and generalized by its suggestion of eternal nature, so that other non-Western countries can claim it as their own. We encounter a similar affinity for images of immortality in his poetry. Our concern is less with the question of literary merit than with the use of a literary medium for asserting modes of transcendence. One poem, written in 1957, actually bears the title The Immortals. 14. It was composed in response to another poem sent to him by a widow who had lost her husband, The Immortalization of THIRD-WORLDISM. 87. Close revolutionary comrade of Mao's, in battle 25 years before. In it Mao reveals his articulate sensitivity to death guilt by commemorating both the dead comrade and his own wife, who had been executed by the cook, Lai Lantang in 1930. The first two lost my proud poplar, and you your willow/poplar and willow soar yetly to the heaven of heaven suggest the immortalization of the two revolutionary martyrs. The poem goes on to describe how the two are presented respectfully with kasha wine by Wukong, a legendary figure said to have sought immortality so intensely that he committed certain crimes in the process, and was therefore condemned for eternity to the Sisyphean task of chopping down a tree which would immediately become whole again each time it was severed. The suggestion of heavenly wine contrasts with an undercurrent of ultimate futility concerning the quest for immortality and of guilt over methods used in the quest. One suspects that this is an unconscious revelation of an aspect of Mao's own psychological state at that time. In any case, the poem's message emerges in its last 4 lines. The lonely goddess in the moon spreads her ample sleeves to dance for these faithful souls in the endless sky. Of a sudden comes word of the tiger's defeat on earth, and they break into tears of torrential rain. The tiger refers to the Kuomintang regime, and the tears of torrential rain express the joy of the 2 Inardirs at the enemy's defeat. The 2 are now clearly immortals, and the poem is a 88 revolutionary immortality, highly romantic but specific formulation that renders their death significant by associating them with revolutionary triumph decades later. Mao's poetry also reveals his capacity to reach back to his psychological roots for the reassertion of an immortal vision. Thus, a poem written in June 1959 when grave national problems coincided with his personal defeats describes his impressions upon returning to his native village and recalling the peasant movement he had led there 32 years earlier. The last half of the poem summarizes its theme. Only because so many sacrificed themselves did our wills become strong, so that we dared command the sun and moon to bring a new day. I love to look at the multiple waves of rice and beans, while on every side the heroes return through the evening haze. The heroes in the last line are peasants returning from work. The immortal Chinese substance they represent blends with an earlier revolutionary combination of sacrifice and omnipotent power that could command the sun and moon to bring a new day. In a poem written in 1962, Mao expresses similar sentiments, only the hero dares to pursue the tiger, still less does any brave fellow fear the bear. The animal references are to the paper tiger of imperialism and to the Russian bear. And once more these exultant images were expressed at a time when Mao must certainly have felt himself threatened by a variety of enemies near and far. For him the moment of greatest danger, the immortalization of words. 89. When one is closest to defeat and extinction is the moment of greatest opportunity for heroic transcendence and revitalization. Mao's romantic imagery of transcendence is again evident in a 1961 poem that tells how the poet would dream a dream in which he could see the land of the hibiscus wholly illuminated by the light of dawn. The land of the hibiscus is a literary name for his native Hunan province, and could in this poem refer to China in general, or even to the entire world becoming a revolutionary promised land of virtue and light. Finally, in a poem written in 1963, containing what Scram refers to as an extraordinary mixture of revolutionary and traditional imagery which epitomizes the whole of thought and ascension, we can observe the combination of power and destructiveness this entails. On our tiny globe, a few flies smash into the walls. They buzz. Some loudly complaining. Others weeping. The ants climb the flowering locust, boasting of their great country, but for ants to shake a tree is easier said than done. Just now the west wind drops leaves on Changan, whistling arrows fly through the air. How many urgent tasks have arisen one after the other. Heaven and earth revolve. Time presses. 10,000 years is too long. We must seize the day. 90. The 4 seas rise high, the clouds and the waters rage, the 5 continents tremble, wind and thunder are unleashed. We must sweep away all the harmful insects until not a single enemy remains. Official commentaries are again helpful. The world becomes tiny for the genuine revolutionary capable of transforming it by his action. The flies represent imperialism or modern revisionism, hurling themselves against the walls of true Marxism-Leninism. The ants are the Soviets, the leaves dropped by the west wind are reactionary forces in general, and Changan, the ancient capital, is China. The whistling arrows are Marxist-Leninist truth, and the ants who climb the flowering locust, boasting of their great country, refer both to insect-like Soviets and to a Tang dynasty legend of a man who dreamt he visited the country of the great flowering locust tree to receive great honors there, only to discover on awakening the real ity behind the dream, an anthill at the foot of a locust tree outside his window. The combination of traditional and revolutionary imagery Scram speaks of, then, reflects precisely the capacity we have repeatedly observed in Mao to create an immortal vision compounded of both revolutionary and Chinese cultural racial themes. The vision includes the annihilation of helpless and self-deceiving adversaries. When the poem was written, the matter was urgent in the extreme. Rather than a smooth and beautiful transcendence, all is wind and thunder. And the demand to sweep away all of the harmful insects, until not a single enemy remains is a peal of totalism, an image of the immortalization of words. 91. Armageddon containing the most malignant aspects of the power-purity constellation. It has often been said that a historical innovator manages to interpret the most fundamental experiences of his generation. Such experiences inevitably involve coping with death and achieving symbolic immortality. We may say that Mao has done precisely that, always with an impulse toward the transcendent, and not only for his own generation. His accomplishments and inclinations rendered him a likely candidate for the excesses of virtue with which the Cultural Revolution was to anoint him. Over the course of Mao's later career, the word becomes not only flesh but his flesh. The man-word corpus is increasingly represented as absolutely identical with China's destiny. And we sense that we are witnessing the tragic transition from the great leader to the despot. Mao's active participation in the creation of his own cult has become increasingly clear. His rewriting of earlier works in order, as Scram says, to remove both youthful errors and any points of fact or doctrine which did not suit the current orthodoxy is consistent with practices of other modern communist leaders, and also with those of pre-modern Chinese emperors in the process of enthroning themselves and establishing new dynasties. But Mao seems to go further than anyone else in the infusion of his man-word corpus into every psychological cranny of Chinese existence. So involved has he become with the principle of the cult of the leader that much of his anger toward Khrushchev was believed to be bound up 92 revolutionary immortality with the latter's policy of de-Stalinization and accompanying theoretical attack upon the cult of personality in general. Thus, when Edgar Snow observed that China had been criticized for fostering such a cult, Mao admitted that perhaps there was some. Mao then pointed out that Stalin had been the center of a cult of personality, and asked in turn whether it was possible that Khrushchev fell because he had no cult of personality at all. Mao apparently requires the immortalizing corpus for his romantic sense of self and history, his image of heroic confrontation with the powers of heaven and earth. The extremities of the deification would seem to confirm his highly active complicity in the process, and his loss of perspective concerning its wider impact. One thinks of the shock and disgust of Eastern European audiences when reviewing dramatic performances by visiting Chinese troops in which the image of Mao became almost leader-ally a deity. And of incidents such as the reported comment of an old Uyghur from Xinjiang, upon shaking hands with Mao, in the past we greeted each other wishing, Iluta protect you, today we have changed this into the party protect you, Chairman Mao protect you. One thinks too of the remarkable feat of physical endurance Mao is alleged to have demonstrated on July 16, 1966, at the age of 72, in a 9-mile swim down the Yangtze in the extraordinary time of 65 minutes, despite stopping at one point to teach a young woman the immortalization of words. 93. Backstroke. The attendant stress upon Chairman Mao's good health and long life seemed to make him into a kind of legendary hero who had achieved something close to physical omnipotence and immortality of the flesh. Zero and most significant of all has been the godlike style of Mao's participation in public events such as the Great Red Guard Rally of August 18, 1966, at which he emerged at sunrise, a silent divinity who witnessed everything and by his mere presence conferred upon hundreds of thousands on other occasions, millions, of young people a sense of being reawakened in purity much in the manner of an Indian holy man who need only make an appearance before ordinary people to transmit his godlike power to them. But the great leader turns into a despot when he loses confidence in his claim to immortality. Then, feeling himself threatened by biological and symbolic death, he becomes obsessed with survival as such. He is no longer able to put his death guilt effectively in the service of a noble mission, and instead becomes an eternal survivor who requires the defeat or death of a never-ending series of enemies in order to reactivate his own life and revive his ever-faltering sense of immortality. We may then suspect 0. The event was filmed, but some observers are convinced that the Chinese employed a double for Mao, or if not, that they falsified such things as the length of the swim and the time in which it was achieved, and neglected to mention the Yangtze's strong current, which could be a factor in carrying a swimmer rapidly over a considerable distance. Whatever the manipulations involved, the purpose of the swim was to demonstrate Mao's vigor following what was admitted to have been a long illness. 94. That he depends heavily upon the mechanism of denial, upon the fantasy "I am not losing my power, I am not dying." He resorts to ever more desperate and magical efforts at achieving vitality. Since no one can provide the power over death that is sought, all become enemies, and we begin to observe something close to the Caligula-like state I have described elsewhere. 1g as survivor paranoia. Also involved is an old man's fear that he is losing his potency. In speaking of the potency of a great revolutionary, I refer by no means only to his sexual capacity or physical strength, but to the special power of one who has felt himself to be a transmitter of forces shaping the destiny of mankind. Here it is instructive to compare Mao with Gandhi. We may say that in old age both experienced the sense of declining power, and that both sought to revitalize themselves through reassertion of purity. In Gandhi's case, that purity took the form of a personal demonstration of control, his sleeping with naked young girls as a form of experiment with temptation and exercise in sexual restraint. Both men sought to buttress a relationship to the eternal by calling upon the purity and life power of the young, but where Gandhi looked upon this aspect of his struggle as a private discipline, Mao enlarged his quest for purity to include the whole of China. And am not suggesting that Mao is mad, nor am I making a clinical psychiatric diagnosis of any kind. There is no convincing evidence for such a diagnosis. Moreover, one must be very cautious about applying individual psychopathological terms to collective behavior. What I am suggesting as possibly relevant to Mao is a state of mind affecting aging leaders after long and repeated survivor-like crises in which there can be certain paranoid contours. The immortalization of wards. 95. Stake the future of an entire revolution upon it. This is not to suggest that the Cultural Revolution is a product merely of Mao's intrapsychic struggles, but rather that such inner struggles now spread confusion and antagonism, rather than the illumination they had in the past. Thus threatened by loss of personal and revolutionary power, the bold stroke of a leader's genius becomes the despotic turbulence of an eternal survivor. 17 In classical psychoanalytic terms, one could view the entire process as the death of the father, the aging leader's reluctance to permit the inevitable ascendancy of his assertive sons. But it may be more accurate to speak of it as the death of the word. The capacity of the revolutionary Maoist combination of words and images to mediate between inner and outer worlds is, at least temporarily, moribund. Hence Mao's plunge into psychism, into a one-sided focus upon intrapsychic purity at the expense of extrapsychic reality. In place of his formerly sensitive application of personal passions to China's desperate historical experience, we encounter instead a misplaced faith in his own psychic state, a substitution of his own psychic history for history at large. Because he and a few around him fear the death of the revolution, China must be made to convulse. In this psychism there remains a combined vision of noble aspiration and total manipulation, as vividly revealed in a statement Mao made in 1958 during the Great Leap Forward. 96. Apart from their other characteristics, China's 600 million people have two remarkable peculiarities. They are, first of all, poor, and secondly blank. That may seem like a bad thing. But it is really a good thing. Poor people want change, want to do things, want revolution. A clean sheet of paper has no blotches, and so the newest and most beautiful words can be written on it, the newest and most beautiful pictures can be painted on it. Each Chinese really man himself is a tabula rasa, a clean sheet of paper upon which anything can be written. By imprinting upon his mind the newest and most beautiful words and the newest and most beautiful pictures, all problems of the inner and outer worlds can be solved. One thinks of Mao in his Yan'an cave, his view of the world symbolized by the sparse contents of his rickety bookcase, mainly Chinese classics and the works of Marx and Lenin, and one can imagine how, in times of crisis, he would make a spiritual return to that magnificent isolation and seek to impose his heroic purities upon all of his countrymen. For the image is partly metaphorical. Mao's reading was by no means limited to Chinese classics and Marx and Lenin. Moreover, Yan'an was at that time a busy small city with activities of every kind and a considerable number of visitors from various parts of the world. Yet Mao did live in a cave, and Mao worked at night by the pale light of a single candle. More important was the state of mind developed in Yan'an and other geographically obscure communist sanctuaries, what Benjamin Schwartz speaks of as an image of society as the immortalization of words. 97. This is the true meaning of the Yan'an complex. TT is also the essence of psychism. The leader turns inward tone increasingly idiosyncratic and extreme vision of immortality, and demands that his vision be permanently imprinted upon all. Mao's actions belie his stated willingness to leave assessments of present revolutionary developments to future generations. As much as any leader in recent centuries, he seeks to chart and control history and fix its course for centuries to come. 19. The more resistance to this course he encounters among the living, the more he looks toward the infinity of the future and seeks an indication from the unborn. An armed camp of comrades in arms, united in clear-cut conflict against the ubiquitous reactionary enemy. 18.1 Law 31, $G, TK7 Technology and Psychism $3. The phenomenon of psychism, then, is a key to the limitations of the Maoist vision. And psychism is intimately bound up with technology, with the distinction man must make between self and things, between mind and its material products. Man has been struggling with this distinction since he fashioned his first tool, and the evolution of the modern world is closely tied up with it. But the distinction has never been complete. Nor perhaps can it, since we perceive external things only by means of internal or mental forms, so that there is a sense in which the only significance technology can have for us lies in the images we create around it. The problem is heightened by the overwhelming presence of 20th century things, and the increasing psychic tendency for man to recreate himself according to a technological model. It is further compounded by the polar ambivalence felt by contemporary man for technology, on the one hand a source of liberation from poverty and oppression, on the other a means of total annihilation. In this sense, China's struggles with technology are part mortality. 102. Of a vast confusion that envelopes the entire planet. Her struggles are intensified by her relatively backward position within a series of keenly felt rivalries with the more developed countries, with the White West, and with the Soviet Union. There is a strong Chinese feeling that technology can be a route to the recovery of past cultural glory. Hence, Mao's hunger for technology, together with his insistence that it be acquired on his own spiritual terms, can be seen as the latest episode in China's 100-year struggle to cope with the modern world according to the unworkable principle of grafting alien Eve-turn knowledge and technique onto an immutably Chinese essence. We are not surprised that psychism of various kinds emerged very strongly during the movement epitomizing Mao's confrontation with technology, the Great Leap Forward. The beautiful words and beautiful pictures he then envisioned being written and painted on a blank Chinese people were words and pictures of rapid technological achievement. His assumption was that China might not need as much time as previously thought to catch up with the big capitalist countries in industrial and agricultural production. Equally significant was the simultaneous emergence of the slogan of the uninterrupted or permanent revolution, a slogan which can be understood as an ideological call to revolutionary immortality, and which paved the way for the Cultural Revolution. The methods of the Great Leap Forward, to be sure, had a compelling external logic, putting into use the human labor with which rural China abounds as a substitute for the large machinery she lacks, and thereby creating both national and local self-sufficiency, or, as the official technology and psychism. 103. Slogan had it, walking with two legs. It turned out that the legs were largely psychic, and while psychic legs are of the greatest importance, they cannot substitute for either bodile, or technological ones, especially in the invoking of steel. Underlying this logic, then, was a quality of feeling that Skernon and Schell describe as magnificent madness. From early 1958 on, all of China was in a fever pitch of work. Everywhere backyard steel furnaces were erected, roads, dams, reservoirs, small-scale factories were built. Steel, symbol of Stalin's industrialization, had been the preserve of a few modern plants. Now everyone could make his own steel. Just as the masses were the foundations of politics, now they would become the foundation of the economy. As the organized masses hurled themselves into the front line of production, their cadre leaders became dizzy with success. As products rolled out of the factories and production figures climbed, the cadres felt that for years they had been subject to a gigantic swindle which they called the fetishism of technology. Industrial work was not so complicated as the educated technicians had told them. Who needed complex blueprints when a single drawing sufficed? Economists had told them they must keep careful records. Why, when a few figures were enough to tell the planners what the masses were doing? In any case, the need for planners was not so great any longer. Planning work was sitting in offices, and that was bureaucratism. The state would soon wither away, the cadres were told, and so thousands of trained economists were fired from their jobs. These backyard furnaces were actually for the smelting of pigeon. 104. The beneficence lay in a vision of vast technological transformation achieved by angle for ordinary to and specialized Hunan beings. The madness lay in the assumption that one could ignore the intellectual and mechanical requirements of technology and depend instead upon Hunan will. The backyard furnace became a symbol of the topsy-turvy world of the Great Leap, at first a source of wonder as it appeared where no furnace had ever been, heralding exciting innovations in production bv the people, and then dissolve its effectiveness against primitive countries is limited unless the user wanted to do the unthinkable and erase the target country with all its life off the map. 10 Gain is surely right about Mao's raising significant issues concerning military and especially political limitations of nuclear weapons, in contrast to the tendency of many leaders in other countries to embrace the weapons as all-powerful deities in a pattern I have elsewhere called nuclearism. But the idea that primitive countries need not fear nuclear weapons is, at the very least, highly questionable, consistent in tone with other Maoist imagery, even more clearly psychistic in nature. Thus, assertions have been made that Mao's doctrine on people's war is a spiritual atomic bomb possessed only by China which is much more powerful than actual nuclear weapons, and that the concept of nuclear weapons being decisive in warfare is put forth by modern revisionists to frighten the revolutionary people into giving up resistance. We sense that Maoist psychism concerning nuclear weapons, as elsewhere, is intimately bound up with the fear of the death of the Chinese Revolution. This tendency becomes more pronounced in Mao's claim, made during an exchange with Jawaharlal Nehru in Technology and I, Kikis Jain. 117. Moscow in 1957, that nuclear war would at worst kill half of Ankinkl and the other half will remain while imperialisnel would be raised to the GRUND and the whole world become socialist. In a number of years there would be 2,700 million people again and definitel more. And we encounter its most extreme expression of all in a comment on atomic war that appeared in an unsigned 1960 editorial in Red Flag, the theoretical organ of the party, which was believed either to have been written by Mao or directly inspired by him. Should the imperialists impose such sacrifices on the peoples of various countries, we believe that, just as the experience of the Russian Revolution and the Chinese Revolution shows, those sacrifices would be rewarded. On the debris of imperialism, the victorious people would create very swiftly a civilization thousands of times higher than the capitalist system and a truly beautiful future for themselves. 16 One is left with the uneasy feeling that the author of this passage comes close to seeing nuclear holocaust as a vehicle for the realization of revolutionary immortality. The apocalyptic image of world destruction at the hands of terrible nuclear deities, followed by a magnificent Kali live resurrection of true believers, joins Maoist psychism with a form of ardent nuclearism. Mao's stress upon nuclear afterlife, upon the general ca pacify to survive nuclear war, sometimes resembles that of the early Herman Kahn. Mao's musings on the subject, as recorded by Snow, reveal, first, a certain disdain for those who call attention to the power of the weapons. Revolutionary. 118. Americans also said very much about the destructiveness of the Ateny Bonil, and Khrushchev had made a big noise about that. They had all surpassed him in this respect, so that he was more backward than they. Was that not so? Mao then becomes almost lyrical in his description of the persistence of life in the Bikini Islands 6 years after the nuclear tests there, referring to an American report he had read. When first entered the island they had to cut open paths through the undergrowth. They found mice scampering about and fish swimming in the streams as usual. The well water was potable, plantation foliage was flourishing, and birds were twittering in the trees. Probably there had been 2 bad years after the tests, but nature had gone on. In the eyes of nature and the birds, the mice, and the trees, the atom bomb was a paper tiger. Possibly man has less stamina than they? 17. The ironic final question suggests that, after all, Mao lacks complete faith in man's capacity to survive nuclear weapons, and the whole passage reflects on East Asian identification with eternal nature as a mode of symbolic immortality to an extent that the issue of human survival becomes almost irrelevant. But the overall tone is Mao's characteristic one of minimization of nuclear destruction. We thus encounter in relationship to the weapons a convergence of psychism and nuclearism, the one a response of intrapsychic purification, the other an embrace of the one could also interpret the irony question as suggesting that man has more stamina than trees, birds, and any, though this interpretation seems less likely than the one I suggest above. Technology and Psychism. 119. New deity, both calling forth denial and psychic numbing to fend off an accurate picture potential nuclear killing. This convergence of psychism and nuclearism was in some ways furthered by China's own acquisition of the weapons. Not only did she bend all efforts toward obtaining them, but when successful in doing so greeted the new possessions with joyous embrace and celebration of national power. Again, these attitudes are hardly unknown among other countries. But with the Chinese the achievement became associated with pride of autonomous accomplishment vis-a-vis both the Soviet Union and the United States, which had repeatedly underestimated China's nuclear capacity. In addition, the Chinese have ideologically connected the weapons with their militant worldview. They speak of their mastery of them as having given great encouragement to the revolutionary peoples of the world in their struggles and having boosted the morality of all revolutionaries. Such nuclearism reached a climax with China's first successful hydrogen bomb test explosion, which occurred at the height of the Cultural Revolution in June 1967. The news was greeted with singing and dancing in the streets, the waving of little red books of quotations from Mao, and pronouncements everywhere on the source of the great achievement as the invincible thought of Mao Tse-tung. The Peking Review of June 23, 1967, reports, Peking was jubilant when it got the news late in the night of June 17, and the reception center of the party Central Committee and the state. 120. But all this is by no means the entire story of China's and Mao's encounter with nuclear weapons. For instance, in Non-Etunber 1964, just 1 month after its first detonation of a nuclear weapon, the Chinese chastised Japan for her alliance with the United States and warned her of the danger of being pushed into the abyss of nuclear calamity. The warning could be viewed as a political use of the newly acquired weapon and to a certain extent a form of nuclearism. But the phrase abyss of nuclear calamity, which the Chinese have used frequently in other situations as well, reflects a recognition that precisely such a calamity stalks everyone, even primitive countries like China herself. It is true that the Chinese, even after their acquisition of the weapons, have continued to employ the paper tiger image, though inevitably about the other fellow's nuclear bombs rather than their own. The general historical experience, however, has been that the very possession of nuclear weapons in a Vari Council was the focus of celebrating throngs. Carrying portraits of Chairman Mao, holding red banners high and waving their quotations from Chairman Mao Tse, people converged on the center to offer congratulations. Cheers, gongs, drums and firecrackers resounded throughout the night. Congratulatory messages unanimously described the successful explosion of China's first hydrogen bomb as marking the start of a new stage in the development of nuclear weapons in China, as an event proclaiming the total bankruptcy of the nuclear monopoly blackmail practiced by the US imperialists and the Soviet revisionists, and a demonstration that for the Chinese people armed with the brilliant thought of Mao Tse-tung, there is no height that cannot be scaled, no fortress that cannot be stormed, and no force that can hold back their victorious advance. Technology and Psychism. 121. Of weighs forces upon a nation some recognition of the actualities of their destructive power, and China is no exception. Indeed, the Maoists have never entirely repudiated that initial recognition of nuclear weapons as constituting a revolution in the art of war. This recognition has been reflected in China's international political and military stance, a stance characterized by what one commentator has called prudent aggressiveness, 20 another the tendency to bluster belligerently while behaving with extreme caution. 21 This behavior is consistent with the side of Mao's thought we have insufficiently emphasized, his own pragmatism in certain areas, especially that of coping with one's enemies. Strategically we should despise all our enemies, but tactically we should take them all seriously, despise the enemy with respect to the whole, but Chinese views on the spread of nuclear weapons suggest such a recognition. Prior to their own initial detonation of 1964, the Chinese tended to stress the advantages of nuclear proliferation, especially to communist countries, as a means of breaking the nuclear monopoly of America and the Soviet Union, and of furthering the cause of peace. But since that time, Chinese attitudes toward proliferation have been more muted and rather ambivalent. Nor have the Chinese demonstrated any inclination toward nuclear sharing. Moreover, they have in various ways shown awareness of the limitations of their nuclear capacity and the dangers to them posed by America's superior nuclear weapons and by the widely publicized inclinations of certain American militarists toward destroying the main Chinese nuclear installations. The Chinese have also reiterated their program for universal nuclear disarmament, declared that China would under no circumstances be the first to use nuclear weapons, and invited other nuclear powers to join them in a no first use agreement. 19 An evolutionary immortality 122 Take hero seriously with respect to each and every concrete question. We know why thus say that in matters of destructive potential, and especially nuclear weapons, technology pinges constantly upon psychism and renclares it new, re and 1110 re untenable. But nuclearism in other quarters, the United States, Russia, France, and the rest of the world, also reverberates upon the special Maoist combination of psychism, nuclearism, and pragmatism. A closely related confrontation concerns the technology of population control. Best estimates of China's present population usually range from 700 to 800 million, with the anticipation, at the current growth rate, of 1 billion people by about 1985. We have observed Maoist China's proud sense of her own vast numbers, her frequent reminders that more than 1/4 of mankind is Chinese, to be an assertion of immortal cultural substance, as linked with the communist revolution. Also contributing to a general disinclination toward population control are such divergent influences as the old Confucian stress upon large families and upon the absolute filial obligation to produce posterity, zero intense nationalism, and a purist Marxist position, which bitterly condemns any suggestion that Malthusian dangers of overpopulation might apply to a communist society with rational control over production and distribution. So strongly have the Mencius, Confucius' great disciple, said, there are 3 unfilial acts, and the lack of posterity is the greatest. Technology and Psychism 123. Maoists felt on the subject that an editorial in the People's Daily in April 1952 went so far as to describe birth control as a means of killing Chinese without shedding blood. But given the relentless realities of feeding and housing the ever-increasing number of Chinese, this purist attitude could simply not be sustained. And during the last half of the 1950s, especially during the liberal period of the Hundred Flowers, the idea of birth control began to take hold as a respectable ideological position. To be sure, that position had to be specifically disassociated from reactionary Malthusian doctrine. China was adopting birth control measures to protect women and children and bring up and educate our younger generation in a way conducive to the health and prosperity of the nation. But the outcome in any case was an energetic national program that included the building of factories for the manufacture of contraceptives, widespread mass media dissemination of information about family planning, and the spread of birth control clinics and information centers from the cities into the rural areas. But this pragmatic interlude ended abruptly in 1958 because, as we might well suspect, it was incompatible with the heroic visions of the Great Leap Forward. Indeed, at that time Maoist spokesmen took the extraordinary position that China was not overpopulated at all, that in respect to the vast demands of socialist reconstruction she was underpopulated and in need of more manpower. The president of Peking University, Ma Ying-Chu, who had earlier emphasized the hardships of uncontrolled population growth for the Chinese people, now 124 revolutionary Immortality suddenly found himself denounced as a rightist and a Malthusian, and was subsequently dismissed from his university post. Ines Ital, Li, the psychism pervading the Great Leap entered into the highly symbolic issue of population control. Reasoned technical planning for the feeding and housing of China's innesses gave way to a psychological insistence upon their mystical strength and invincibility. For at that moment in particular China's immortal substance could not be questioned, birth control became an assault upon Chinese power, an attack upon revolutionary immortality. Yet during the period of liberalization following the Great Leap, especially in 1962, birth control partisans again spoke out. Once more attempts were made to limit population with encouragement of late marriage and small families, and these policies continue to the present. But the effort has been somewhat sluggish and, in the opinion of knowledgeable observers, very far indeed from coping with China's actual situation. Moreover, one suspects that it has been especially slack during the Cultural Revolution. Of the greatest importance, however, is the fact that the Cultural Revolution does not appear to be making a major point of unclerntaining efforts at birth control. This at least suggests a limitation to its psychism in one of the most fundamental of all areas. For no regime ruling China can avoid being impressed by material éclairé of population increase and its consequences, however it seeks to shield itself from such evidence. The technology of population control, therefore, could in the long run be one of technology and psychism. 125 The most significant restraints upon Maoist psychism and totalism. Me sense in Mao, as in Chinese policy in general, a profound inner CLI/Asian concerning technology. As a 20th century and a great revolutionary leader he is profoundly drawn to it, knowing it to be essential both to his revolution and to the welfare of his people. Yet his resentment of technology seems equally profound, as revealed in the heroic desperation he brings to his efforts to replace it with psychic power and with Chinese essence. Observing his dilemma, we in the West can ill afford to gloat, living as we do in societies being devoured by their own technologies. We know that Mao is hardly the first to discover or to cause his most devoted disciples to discover that one cannot have it both ways. See Friday. 0 Pia time and totalism. Psychological limitations. Man's psychic state can be pushed just so far. Or, when pushed to extremes, these can be maintained for just so long. Then psychological and historical forces converge to place limits upon individual psychism and group totalism. In my study of Chinese thought reform I suggested 3 such limitations: mounting response of inner antagonism or hostility of suffocation, the effective penetration of the ideotite milieu control by outside influences that undermine the closed communication system, and a law of diminishing conversions operating among those subjected to repeated reform experiences, according to which inner enthusiasm is increasingly replaced by outward compliance. I would suggest that all 3 patterns have been prominent in limiting the totalism and psychism of the Cultural Revolution. there can be little doubt of the widespread experience of hostility of suffocation. The evidence comes to us not only from observations of visitors and defectors, but from the Chinese press and radio, and especially from the great character posters so prominent throughout. The tones of anger and hatred in the accusations and counter-accusations reported by all of these sources have been revolutionary. 1. Immortality. 130. Startling even to those familiar with the explosive series of en-masse campaigns carried out by the communist regime since its inception in 1949. As in the case of these earlier, cultural revolution was part of a command performance. But very quickly there emerged hatreds of a more unfocused nature, including the rage of people pressed beyond balance and pushed into untenable stances of psychism. This rage was expressed in the violent acts of Mao's opponents, and occasionally in those of their words that broke through the Maoist control of the communications media. And it was also expressed in the vitriolic language of Mao's supporters. For when hostility of suffocation begins to suffuse a national atmosphere, anger takes hold as a prevailing if unstable idiom of discourse, irrespective of who is shouting and who is being shouted at. An additional manifestation of the hostility of suffocation goes beyond hostility itself, withdrawing from the overall psychic and physical struggle. We are finally hearing of groups of alienated Chinese youth, a phenomenon that must have been present, or at least latent, for some time. They go by the evocative name of wanderers, and a description of them appearing in a Shanghai newspaper in July 1967 makes them sound familiar indeed. Contributing to the hostility of suffocation is the classical populist dilemma: the masses are idealized as the source of virtue and ways of coping with contemporary problems of historical change and successfully managing any large-scale society. Time and totalism, psychological limitations. 131. In the course of the Great Cultural Revolution, a number of people have emerged who do not pay attention to state affairs and who stay out of the revolutionary movement. These people are called wanderers. They take an attitude of non-intervention in the struggle between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. Instead of fighting on the battlefront, they wander about school campuses, parks, and streets. They spend their time in swimming pools and playing chess and cards. Whenever they are required to reveal an attitude, they just issue vague statements. They have voluntarily withdrawn from the political stage. Point 2. The familiarity becomes even more striking when the article goes on to claim that these wanderers have lost their bearings even though they may appear to be blissful. The temptation to bestow upon the group the name Chinese hippies should probably have been resisted, pending a bit more information about them and especially about their inner lives. But that characterization was immediately made by at least one Western commentator. We are probably justified in saying that, like hippies, wanderers are in some degree explorers of the self, although we have no reason to believe that they necessarily embrace the full range of hippie patterns. For this they must inevitably be denounced as people who put self-interest above all else. Among hippie patterns, I include a form of nonviolent rejection of and withdrawal from ordinary participation in society, a stress upon and a variety of experiential intensity explorations in individual and group intimacy, all resulting in the formation of a rather discrete subculture with its own language and mores. 132. If contemporary Chinese wanderers are not quite hippies, however, they do seem to be related to resistive, innovative, and in various ways alienated youth groups throughout the world. Like these other youth groups, they reflect large confusions accompanying rapid historical change and the search for alternatives to existing social identities. And it is also possible to find historical antecedents to them in the Taoists of traditional China who sought escape from the demanding Confucian social order by way of withdrawal and mysticism. But whatever their historical and cultural roots, the wanderers' emergence has undoubtedly been greatly intensified by the Cultural Revolution itself. The same newspaper article thus includes among their number some people who have made mistakes in the course of the Cultural Revolution movement, others who took part in it for personal reasons fearing it would turn against them but who tried to stop halfway when they realized their goal could not be realized, others who were so-called veteran rebels who after a long period became tired of the civil wars among the mass organizations to which they belonged, and instead of seeking ways to stop the civil wars and making efforts to fight the common enemy, flew the flag of truce to avoid trouble. In other words, people who felt hemmed in and fearful, who chose withdrawal from, rather than direct resistance to, what they must have come to view as absurd physical and verbal struggles around them. Such people are the very antithesis of the official version of the ideal youth, totally and unquestioningly committed to Maoist views and policies. Wanderers, it would see in Time and Totalism, Psychological Limitations 13.3 care little for Mao's thoughts or visions, and after giving lip ice to them, seek either their own pleasure or a bit of quietude. But the article about them warns that although they look passive about the revolution now, in the future they will become bitter and tough and no longer peaceful, possibly a projection of Maoists' own violent feelings, but perhaps also to some extent an accurate perception of the hostility of suffocation underneath the wanderers' apparent passivity. Moreover, by causing all schools to be closed for more than a year and encouraging the Red Guards to travel about the country and participate in various movements on behalf of Maoist aims, the Cultural Revolution could be said to have made additional contributions to a style of psychic and physical wandering. Concerning the second psychological limitation, the undermining of milieu control by ideas from the outside, we may again point to the specter of modern revisionism. There is one aspect of this specter around which Maoists have undoubtedly been able to mobilize considerable fear and antagonism: Chinese resentment and injured pride over Russian attitudes perceived as patronizing in regard to helping a junior communist partner, over what I spoke of before as a situation of counterfeit nurturance. And there have been very real bases for antagonism between the two countries concerning ideological and tactical matters. Yet it seems clear that Chinese minds have been indelibly marked by revisionist images, especially by images of liberalization and pragmatism as alternatives to totalism and psychism. Concrete evidence of this has been the appearance in Revolutionary Mortality. 134. China of a new trend apparently influenced by revisionist as well as by independent Marxist principles, and possibly by egalitarian non-Marxist ones as well. Whether the new trend is an actual organization or a loose body of thought is not clear, but there are indications that it raises fundamental questions about the uses of power by both Maoist and anti-Maoist groups during and prior to the Cultural Revolution. Human history can be defined as the continuous spread of ideas and images from mind to mind and group to group, and in our present electronic age it becomes particularly futile to attempt to seal off any collectivity from impinging outside currents. China's extremely advanced human control mechanisms, vast geographical terrain, and relatively limited communications technology would seem to make her an ideal nation for such sealing off. But these Chinese attributes can in fact do no more than slow down the mental invasion, and in the Cultural Revolution they have served mainly to feed a double illusion, that of milieu control itself, and that of the capacity of a milieu, once penetrated, to cast off the outside evil and re-establish its internal purity. The third limitation on psychism and totalism, the law of diminishing conversions, follows directly upon the other two. Here we encounter the built-in contradiction of psychism. In its zeal to replace technology with mind, it tends to interfere with precisely the internal work necessary to accomplish real individual conversion and general social transformation. While extolling the mind and the will as creators of external reality, the Cultural Revolution has lacked the patient assurance and steady effort necessary for genuine reshaping of mental time and totalism, psychological limitations J35 processes. 0. This assurance and effort could be said to have been present during earlier thought reform campaigns, though and then results tended to be mixed. The Cultural Revolution utilized such standard thought reform elements as criticism and self-criticism, group-mediated shame and guilt, and the by now classic Maoist subject matter. But public demonstration was substituted for internal experience, activism for psychic work, violence for persuasion, and ultimately, one suspects, uneasy obedience for significant inner change. See now the full paradox of psychism. There is the insistent substitution of the psychic state for the machine, but the psychic work required for authentic inner change is in turn replaced by an image of the change having already taken place. So predominant does the vision of revolutionary immortality become that confusion exists not only between mind and thing but between mentation and external action. Confronted by these psychological limitations, Mao begins to manifest what has been called the end of Cha, loss of some of the magnetic hold he has had upon his followers. Point 4 For that charismatic hold, I would suggest, depends upon the leader's capacity to convey to his followers a convincing mode of immortality. To be sure, the task itself, the kind of reshaping undertaken, was an impossible one, as I have tried to demonstrate. But in addition, and partly as a consequence, human manipulations during the Cultural Revolution were often performed in erratic and unsteady fashion. 136. Until rewarding to enable them to weather the strain his demands place upon their psychic capacities. In Mao's ease, the revolutionary mode offered has surely seen will increasingly imperfect to large numbers of former followers, and the more they have questioned it, the more he has asked of them. The result has been a vicious circle of the leader's strong demands, followers' mistrust and resentment, and escalated demands, the whole process intensified by the general anticipation of the leader's death. This is part of the leader's loss of potency we spoke of before. He cannot totally avoid knowing in himself that virtue had gone out of him, but he seeks to fight off and compensate for such knowledge. Followers may become even more quickly aware of his loss of the combination of virtue and power that they had originally responded to, and they in turn feel lost and pressed in unnatural and unfathomable direct ions. The negative side of their dependency and discipleship can then emerge, old resentments become newly reinforced. Principles of belief and guidelines for action, crystal clear until a moment ago, now become hazy and obscure. Assuming all this to have been the experience of many of Mao's followers, they are left with the alternative of either allying themselves with the opposition, withdrawing and becoming wanderers, pretending to remain good Maoists while feeling themselves less and less enthusiastic, or becoming all the more zealous as Aeneans of denying their doubts and suppressing their anger. But the possibility of undergoing a profound and sustained inversion to Maoist doctrine, as held forth as an ideal of the Cultural Revolution, becomes increasingly remote. Titany and totalism, psychological limitations. 137. Can understand these psychological limitations as social expressions of what Freud called the reality principes? If so, what is the reality involved? It would seem to something to do with the very human nature the Taoists tried to deny. I do not mean human nature as a rigid set entity but as a general psychobiological potential within a particular cultural and historical matrix. Human nature thus understood is highly flexible, yet at the same time an imposer of limits. One of these limits is the need for a certain amount of harmony between the evidence of the senses and so-called shared images of self and world. From this standpoint one may view Russian revisionism and de-Stalinization as historical and psychological inclinations toward the harmonies of human nature and away from the excesses of totalism and psychism. Mao might have been expected to welcome these tendencies, having been so long in conflict with Stalin over the latter's policies toward the Chinese Revolution, policies Mao thought to be out of touch with the actualities of the Chinese environment. But his vision of Chinese revolutionary immortality took precedence over all other influences. The contaminations of modern revisionism had to be attacked. In a very important sense, the entire constellation of the Great Leap Forward and Cultural Revolution was called forth to prove the falseness of the idea of human nature as one such contamination, and then to demonstrate the superior psychic and technological possibilities of homegrown revolutionary purity as the shortest and truest path to that ultimate destination of Marxist history. The stage of but both movements turned out instead to 138 and 1 TVOLUTIONNEJM mortality be ivid. Clenonstrations of the psychological limitations of the Maoist /Asian. The false statistics of the Great Leap epitomized this limitation. These falsities are a classic example of the totalistic tendency to view ideological assumptions as truer than truth, and they may well come to be viewed as an equally classic expression of the undermining of psychism through the convergence of technology and man nature. Under such conditions much of man's imagery about his world goes out of joint, notably his images of time. In the same poem in which Mao recalled how we dared command the sun and moon to bring a new day, there is also the phrase "I curse the flux of time." The leader's efforts to recall the heroic past become associated with the unyielding nostalgia of an old man who has known better days and is ill-equipped to cope with new situations. I have in other contexts described this pattern as the mode of residential touration, the urge to return to a mythological past in order to draw upon its ennobling symbols for present sustenance and future direction. Point 5 For Mao, the revolutionary past is pure, while the present, tainted as it is by modern revisionism and by a technology that insists on being more than an extension of spirit or will, is profoundly I'm here and elsewhere. In the essay I have stressed the interplay of the psychological and historical to the neglect of questions of social structure. An alternative analysis could emphasize the Maoist attack upon consolidating social institutions of all kinds, and an attempt to create new institutions that lend themselves to continuous revolutionary ferment. But I believe that the psycho-historical limitations I emphasize are consistent with such an analysis, and in fact underlie the structural difficulties Maoists have encountered. Time and Totalistan. Psychological limitations. 131, pure. But the restorationist tends to be deeply attracted to ILW very symbols of condemn he so passionately condemns. A lid 1 it, 11 st at least raise the possibility that the extravagant tone of the Cultural Revolution can be partly explained by a Hickelden attraction felt Mao and the Maoists toward the entire revisionist worldview, including its accommodation both to technology and human nature. To the extent that this paradox prevails, it exerts a further limitation upon the entire movement because it requires Maoists to struggle against these tendencies, not only as put forth by their enemies but as exerting seductive appeal within themselves. At the same time, we know the Cultural Revolution to have embraced a seemingly opposite and perhaps even more intense mode of transformation, a demand for almost instant remaking of society and man, according to the model of the thought of Mao. This wavering between restorationism and transformationism is not unique, given the related psychological nature of the two polar modes. What is unique is the extremity of each, the restorationist curse of the flux of time, and need to create a revolution on the old model for young Chinese who had never fought a war and never seen an imperialist or known capitalism and power, and the transformationist insistence that the rate of change be ever accelerated, that man and society change overnight. What results is a pattern of conflicting demands, which we may term nostalgic preoccupation with newness. And the pattern is especially confusing to those who respond most enthusiastically to the original call. For instance, our evolutionary immortality. 140. Groups of recalgoarcles who had originally been hailed as the purest of the pure, were being the young heroes, now sekel just a few eons later as old rebels, as lonely fighters who clive in a tiny little circle and lie on the couch of their great deeds. Originally praised for their militancy in breaking down the old and establishing the new, they were denounced for irresponsible showing of muscles and participation in riotous events. So quick were shifts in prescribed standards of behavior that even the most loyal Maoist could no longer be sure of the proper way. Not infrequently the Red Guards themselves, the very agents of rebirth, loomed as the main threat to efficient Maoist control. Confusion in relationship to past and future, to time itself, had created a psychic flux so extreme that yesterday's command became today's crime. With standards changing so quickly, months passed during which virtually no social forms could be described as stable, a good definition of chaos. Attacks upon those in authority extended diffusely to virtually all government leaders. Violent clashes took place between contending groups within the Red Guards and revolutionary rebels. There was massive shifting of sides amidst a sea of ideological fervor and opportunism, and considerable breakdown in work schedules, transportation, and communications throughout various parts of the country. It became difficult indeed for anyone to be certain as to which group was furthering revolutionary immortality. Although rarely asked in public, one suspects that during 1966 and 1967 life in China frequently became psychological litnitation tim and totalistan. Donanatekl by the IVHCRC Docs 1, Uri//lie. Question: should one or should one not destroy AI, IISI of S, Y at Sun, and eat in revolutionary to shoreblit.non.com philogist and replace it with of Mao How 1, should one distinguish between genuine Angkor I and Turfet Red Guards. If the Shanghai Kowloon was to be an ideal 1110 Dell for all of China, what /Vas 1 to think of the triple which replaced it just a few days after it came into being? Granted that demolition bombs and hand grenades will be thrown, who was to throw them and at which targets? Under such conditions of chaotic flux one ran out of both reliable friends and reliable enemies. The path to revolutionary immortality became obscured and enduring emotional commitment to it or anything else became close to impossible. Related to this exaggerated flux was the transformationist myth of eliminating the non-revolutionary past. Here the Cultural Revolution met another impasse. Nothing in the past can be entirely eliminated, nothing is entirely lost to history. There was a rather touching illustration of this principle during the pre-cultural revolution attack upon humanism in 1964, in the experience of a writer and literary theorist named Xiao Chuan Lin. 6 Although himself formerly a severe critic of revisionism, Xiao objected to the narrowness 01 the anti-revisionist campaign and to its demand for oversimplified portrayal of literary subjects. Il was then accused of embracing bourgeois Hutuanism and bourgeois realism, and he and his supporters were labeled potential or real fellow travelers of the revisionists. But he defended his literary vision as one in AT 142. He wished to see largeness from smallness, and a world in a grain of rice. This in turn, however, led his critics to associate him with a previous literary bad example, Hu Feng, who in 1955 had been arrested for counter-revolutionary activities, and had similarly spoken of the importance of ordinary things and of finding a world in a grain of sand. These critics did not go further and identify the actual origin of the expression in a poem of William Blake. Yet in that origin perhaps lies the real significance of the episode, the historical transmission and ultimate survival not only of the phrase itself but of the vision it suggests. For in Blake's original lines to see a world in a grain of sand / and a heaven in a wildflower, / hold infinity in the palm of your hand / and eternity in an hour we encounter powerful alternatives to revolutionary immortality, suggestions of experiential transcendence and embrace of nature which have long been called forth by mystics and poets. To his perpetual need for some form of symbolic immortality man brings a combination of past historical experience and fresh imagination, neither of which can be fully eliminated by totalistic programs. There is always the possibility of the emergence of a mode other than that prescribed. Maoists have had more specific difficulties with the historical record. We have observed the surfacing during the Cultural Revolution of past failures and conflicts, especially those in relationship to the Great Leap Forward. And we have spoken of the related problem of negative reinterpretation of revolutionary accomplishments of distinguished leaders turned evil opponents, the devaluing time and totalist psychological limitations of Liu Shaoqi's How to Be a Good Communist the ES of the generation or two of cotters whose neural perspectives had been impotently shaped by it. Also in connection with dishonoring Liu, the Cultural Revolution has struggled with a specific historical event, the 1936 confessions of a group of revolutionaries renouncing communist beliefs apparently made on direct orders from the part/hierarchy, then represented by Liu in order to effect their release from Kuomintang prisons. The Maoist attack upon both Liu and those who had made the confis most had risen under Liu's patronage to become Zion's high functionaries, took an indirect form in which the principle of negative historical reinterpretation was carried still further. It focused upon another revolutionary, who also made a prominent confession, Li Xiuqiang, a leader of the Taiping Rebellion of 1848-1865. When a leading historian recently presented new evidence suggesting that this confession too had been a conscious form of deception and that Li had remained true to his principles, the historian was publicly denounced and his findings dismissed as contrary to the teaching of Chairman Mao. During the course of the Cultural Revolution, the scholarly journal that had originally published the article was also denounced. There were hints connecting the two historical episodes, and a Maoist principle concerning the general study of history was reiterated, the evaluation of a historical figure is not judgment on a dead man but the drawing of a line between revolutionaries and counter-revolutionaries. In the above sequence we can observe a long-standing Chinese cultural tendency to focus concretely upon 144. Manipulative reinterpretations of historical events as moral models for the present. In the extreme Maoist version of this tendency in favor of the regime, but that this latter mode had suddenly been rendered meaningless by his public disgrace and she now must revert to the former one. There is also a converse but analogous principle, the psychic consequences of toning down a totalist vision of revolutionary immortality. Such abrupt desymbolization and severance from a sense of continuous life can give rise to resentful disillusionment, feelings of emptiness, and a variety of conflicts. These feelings and conflicts are likely to be strongest in those who originally responded most zealously, notably the young. And we may assume that such reactions have had much to do with repeated difficulties reported in controlling the Red Guards, in getting them to go home, return to school, and resume normal lives. These difficulties cannot simply be attributed to the restlessness of young people who have tasted the pleasures of travel and political excitement. What these young people have tasted has been an intimation of immortality, only to find themselves suddenly cast out from that exultant state. One may go further and say that not only Red Guards but Maoist leaders, and even perhaps Mao himself, all face rebound psychological consequences of such undermining of the immortalizing mode to which they have committed themselves so totally. This in turn means facing the universal problems from which they had been temporarily shielded by the power and purity of their revolutionary image, problems of human suffering, meaninglessness, and death itself. Time and totalism, psychological limitations. 147. We have been saying suggests that psychism is limited by the nature of the mind, the body, and the world. While the three are aspects of a metaphysical whole, they cannot be substituted for one another, not even in the name of a transcendent revolutionary vision. -0.9 BC. The last stand. Everything about the Cultural Revolution renders one humble indeed at the very thought of prediction. I refer not only to the surprise with which it burst upon the world and to its continuing unpredictability, so much as to its strange combination of futuristic tone and aura of the past. What we may say is that in many significant ways the Cultural Revolution has been a last stand. It is, as we have seen, the last stand of a great revolutionary against internal and external forces pressing him along that treacherous path from hero to despot. It is similarly the last stand of a collective expression of early revolutionary glory which he has epitomized, and it is perceived on several symbolic levels as a last stand against death itself of the leader, the revolution, and individual man in general. But it can also be seen as a last stand of another less recognized entity, one we innately call militant rectitude, a state of politicized straight and narrow moral earnestness pursued with unrelenting passion. Militant rectitude is an existential style that seems oddly old-fashioned during the latter part of our confusely absurd 20th century. Its model is the Chinese version of the new revolutionary one, immortality, but we readily recognize Conflo Jakian and Chinary Man, Christian, as well as Kananuni.st contributions. During the Cultural Revolution it totally mobilized, self-negating Guard, unswervingly dedicated to living out the immortalizing vision. What threatens militant rectitude is a very different kind of contemporary being I speak of as Protean Man. 1. His psychological style, in direct contrast, is one of interminable exploration and flux, his self-process characterized by relatively easy shifts in belief and identification. He can readily embrace a set of convictions or respond to various kinds of symbols and images. His difficulty is maintaining inner connection with these for more than a brief experimental interlude. He is the very antithesis of Maoist militant rectitude in another aspect as well. His profound inner sense of absurdity, as given prominent expression in a prevailing tone of mockery. His mockery in fact is a specific rejection of moral earnestness and rectitude, a means of giving voice to the absence of fit between inner and outer worlds so characteristic of our era. It is his way of confronting death and the contemporary disjointedness of life and death rather than resorting to the Maoists' political ideological quest for revolutionary immortality. Protean man in fact represents a genre post-Freudian, postmodern style almost totally absent from the image put forth by N/Laoists for the Chinese younger generation, but a style, I would suggest, that neither the Chinese nor anyone else will be completely able to resist. There is a good deal of evidence that Protean man is already emerging everywhere as an important psychology beyond the last stand. 153. Caltype in the West, in Russia, in Japan, and in other parts of East Asia. In fact, I encountered Protean patterns in refugee intellectuals from the Chinese mainland, most of them young, whom I interviewed in depth in 1954 and 1955, suggesting that it has been at least latent in China for some time even if covered over by Maoist images of purity and rectitude. Nor is this surprising, since the Protean style results from a radical breakdown in man's more structured relationship to traditional symbols from psycho-historical dislocation which China has over recent decades experienced in the extreme. It is also influenced by the worldwide revolution in mass communications which tends to flood the individual psyche with endlessly variable images in every sphere of life. This is one revolution that is only at an early stage in China, but it is certainly having its effect. The wanderers and advocates of the new trend we spoke of before appear to be Chinese expressions of this Protean process of a more urban cosmopolitan, experimental, and open lifestyle. Indeed, only the boldest kind of ideologues from the old school of revolutionary purity could have had the temerity to assume that in our present desymbolized nuclear universe an inclination toward the experimental and the absurd could be totally resistable. Does all this suggest the likelihood of a pragmatic turn in China? One must always be cautious about drawing short-term political conclusions from general psychological observations. But suckle a turn would be consistent svitly the 154. And psychological limitations to Maoist technological psychism we have discussed, as well as with the evolution of Protean Neon. The fact is that the turn toward pragmatism has already begun. From the early fall tone of official pronouncements began to alter. There has been an increasing emphasis arsenified by the influence of Zhou Enlai upon calls for restraint for ending disorder, and for re-establishing stability and maximum production. The National Day celebration marked a spirit of compromise between individuals and groups, and in slogans employed. An important part of the trend has been a strong emphasis upon the reopening of all schools, though under the promised program of educational reform which lays great stress upon political thought and upon practical application of learning. The overall policy of compromise is represented as the most recent instruction of Chairman Mao and is accompanied by a vision of the entire nation becoming the great school of the thought of Mao Tse. A program of pragmatic retreat is thus described in the language of Vittori. A pause in the extreme pursuit of revolutionary immortality is represented as its attainment. In accordance with this trend, the targets of criticism are no longer those in authority but incorrigible men in authority or, of even greater significance, infantile left-Leninist image, which in this context neons those who remain too intense in their Maoist militancy. The new beyond the last stand. 155. Political form is that of the Revolutionary Committee, a somewhat muted successor to the Triple Alliance. There remains considerable evidence of discontent and conflict reports in the Chinese press of groups having to be severely chastised for saying such things as the military has seized political power, or for speaking of the great alliance of fake revolutionaries. These are of course resentful expressions of disillusionment, and they contain sufficient truth to grate upon raw Maoist nerves. And as of the beginning of 1968, travelers coming from China continue to report outbreaks of violence and military intervention. But by and large the new stress is upon persuasion and reform, and even the Revolutionary Committee is spoken of as a temporary authority with the implication that the plan is to return to more stable institutions, probably more like those which existed prior to the Cultural Revolution than during its most extreme phases. Aiding this moderating trend are pockets of Chinese society that maintained an effective pragmatic approach throughout, the scientific and technical environments mentioned earlier, and various other relatively stable social, economic, and military arrangements. China will certainly not emerge unchanged by the Cultural Revolution, and the pranatic turn will not be identical with the Russian model. It will surely retain many Maoist features, and it will probably continue to evolve in specifically Chi-One's directions. Nor can one say that similar campaigns against the death of the revolution will not take place in the future, whether under the umbrella of renewed cultural revolution or under another name. But consider 156. Such factors as Mao's advanced age and his centrality to such a process, the general impediments to sustaining militant rectitude at this stage of world history, and the psychic and material cost to China of the events of 1966 and 1967, it is unlikely that anything approaching the excesses of the Cultural Revolution will soon be repeated. Should one, then, as many have, speak of the end of a dynasty? The concept has special significance for China, conveying as it does a traditional image of dissolution of both power and virtue of the mandate of heaven passing from the old group to the new. It suggests the shifting of immortal status and immortalizing capacity from one family to another, from one succession of anointed leaders to another. Yet the phrase may be only half applicable. Mao's life has been so heroic and his ruling power so formidable that their impending termination does have some of the quality of an end of a dynasty, and even if Mao remains an active leader for a considerable period of time, one doubts that he will again have the authority to impose upon his country so extreme a revolutionary vision. But it may be more accurate to speak of the end of one emperor's rule, while the dynasty of Chinese communism continues. One cannot predict future attitudes of Chinese leaders toward the Maoist image, but there is good reason to believe that for some time at least they will continue to hold the image on high even as they retreat from its excesses. The mandate of heaven may be passed not so much to a rival family as to one of a group of contending family members. And in this sense the Cultural Revolution can be viewed as a problem of individual and ideological beyond the last stand J57 succession, the resolution of which will require continuity rather than overthrow. But an evaluation of these envaters depends upon one's sense of the viability of the Chinese communist regime too, and of what may be called Chinese communist culture. Some knowledgeable observers take a highly pessimistic view of China's future. They stress ways in which the Cultural Revolution has cut her off from her own past as well as from the rest of the contemporary world, how it has violated the young, both in the depth of disillusionment created in them and in the radical interruption of their educational process for periods of from 1 to 2 years, how it has undermined the main sources of the regime's authority and ruling capacity, the party and the experienced bureaucracy, and how in various ways it has abused the shame sanctions so central to the functioning of Chinese culture. But while one must recognize enormously destructive influences in precisely these areas, one must also consider the potential durability and flexibility of Chinese communist culture. For instance, although the regime has periodically furthered a myth of total severance from the traditional past, and especially so during the Cultural Revolution, its rhetoric of reform and style of rectitude suggests that it carries that condemned Confucian past in its bones. This very inconsistency between official claim and psychic actuality becomes a source of strength because it means retention of sustaining elements of continuity. Similarly, the regime's inability to seal the country off fully from contemporary historical influences becomes in 158. Revolutionary Lziji the long run a source of viability, though the degree of isolation achieved does present very serious problems. Perhaps the real test for Chinese communist culture will lie in the not-too-distant future when it confronts the full impact of international influence Angl has to deal with its own developing version of protean man, a test Russia has been facing for some time. Nor should one assume the absolute impossibility of some kind of modus vivendi between the regime and a protean style emerging among certain groups of its people. Concerning the violation of the young and the interruption of their educational process, we may anticipate profound reverberations. But any estimate of the situation must also take into account the special malleability of the young. This malleability falls considerably short of what Maoists have often assumed it to be, but it may well be sufficient to enable many to surrender their militant rectitude with a mixture of disillusionment and relief, and to sustain in their own fashion the loss of their schooling. and if we assume that China's young have already absorbed a certain amount of the protean style, this would further enhance their psychological capacity to move on from the Dionysian interlude of the Cultural Revolution to the somewhat more prosaic lifestyles likely to emerge in post-Maoist Chinese society. In the long run, such protean tendencies, among organizers as well as organized, could enable the society to make use of residual and Laoist influences in new and experimental combinations. There is perhaps a hint of this in an evolving form of progressive education which seems to contain elements reminiscent not only of Marx, Lenin, and Mao, but also of John Beyond the Last Stand. 159. When talking about youth, one forgets too easily the NE\V start innate possible by RHYTHMNS of Gen the periodic emergence of large numbers of evad ions adults who have as yet experienced neither revolutionary exaltation nor disillusionment and who can be drawn anew into national programs of development or re-V. When we speak of problems of authority and abuse of the shame sanction, we raise vast issues that will require a great deal more time to evaluate. The regime, to be sure, has never before taken such liberties either with its own structure of authority or with the use of public methods of shaming and humiliation. But one must also consider its well-established pattern of social manipulation, the periodic campaigns and mass movements of extraordinary scope, carved out from the time of the communist takeover in 1949 and based upon models established well before then. The Chinese themselves refer to this pattern as unity struggle unity. It consists of the interruption of relative social calm with a highly organized explosion of accusations of impurity and a great wave of criticism, self-criticism, and confession followed in turn by some form of resolution and return to stability. I refer to the stress upon a policy of learning by doing, the half-work, half-study system, which apparently had its origins in Yan'an and was greatly emphasized during the Cultural Revolution. 3 This half-half system cannot be said to derive from any direct influence of John Dewey, though such influence could be making itself indirectly felt, given the great impact of Dewey's ideas upon the generation to which present senior leaders belong. Revolutionary immortality. 160. Cultural Revolution has followed this model, however unprecedented in violence its stage of struggle has been. The point at issue now is the degree to which the third stage, the return to stability, can be managed by the regime, and the degree to which a measure of political and psychological unity can be re-established. To the extent that it can, emotions of guilt and shame can be put back into some balance with general social policies and goals. If not, they will contribute to every kind of dislocation, every form of anxiety and rage. What one can say is that there is at least a precedent for recovery from induced struggle, if not from the kind of induced catastrophe of the Cultural Revolution. With the psychological idiom we have been using, the great imponderable is the degree to which a post-cultural revolution regime can hold out to the Chinese people a form of symbolic immortality less extreme, and less dependent upon psychism, than that so recently put forward by Mao. We would expect a vision of revolutionary immortality to remain important, but possibly in more open. This pattern of unity struggle unity is also, in a more general way, consistent with cyclic imagery deeply ingrained in traditional Chinese philosophical and historical thought. It is epitomized by the famous first line of the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, which in the past educated Chinese have almost always been able to recite verbatim: empires wax and wane, states cleave asunder and coalesce. The concept is said to go back to the great historian Sima Xiaqin. And the quality of the officials of a particular regime has often been viewed as the controlling factor in the timing of these cycles of order and disorder, as revealed by the comment of the 19th century educator official: as the mind dominates nature, so the quality of officials decides the fate of the empire. Beyond the last stand ig iconal, ination with new forms and other nodes: biological, theological, natural, and experiential. Meanwhile, we may expect that the Cultural Revolution will its traumatic impact in more ways than can now be imagined. Yet I believe it would be very rash to assume that a regime which has so recently commanded so much symbolic power would suddenly cease to possess any at all. It is in the nature of great men and great revolutions to be dissatisfied with their accomplishments, however extraordinary, and to plunge into realms even they cannot conquer. If this be the meaning of tragedy, the tragedy is not merely theirs. Nor is the present task of recovering from Mao's excesses and evolving an equilibrium between life and death appropriate to our age that of China alone.